Chapter 292. The hilt of the short sword in Zhang Yi's hand was soaked in blood. Even though he had relied on 2 consecutive moves of the Ares hanging horn to block Xiaosong's Heaven and Earth Unite attack, the powerful force had split the web between his thumb and index finger and ground his palm. However, at this moment, he was still holding the small sword very tightly. He was using so much force that strands of blood were squeezed out between his fingers. The short and small sword in his hand appeared even rougher and dimmer after being still. It even had some clear granules, and seemed to be made from ordinary stone. Looking at this small sword, and hearing Su Lianhua's question, Ding Ning nodded calmly. "I thought that Xue had passed this sword to you," Su Lianhua said seriously after a moment of silence. Ding Ning glanced at him and said, "Senior sect brother is more generous and steady than me. Naturally, this sword will be passed to him." As the two spoke, Xiaosong fell heavily to the ground and was unable to stand up. The shock of many people present had just started. The small sword that Zhang Yi gripped tightly was naturally Xue Wangshu's life bond sword that had shocked all of Chongling last winter. While the true power contained in this life bond sword had dissipated as its master aged and died, and it had become a lifeless object again, after Xue Wangshu's lifetime of nurturing, this sword and the many sword manuals of White Goat Cave would complement each other. At least, when he used the White Goat hanging horn move just now, there was likely no sword in the world more suitable than this sword. In the past, Chongling did not have a high opinion of Zhang Yi, but now, this sword had not appeared in Ding Ning's hands, but in his. What shocked the spectating students and the cultivation teachers the most was that when they thought of the battle just now, how Zhang Yi had taken the initiative and then stopped. It seemed that Zhang Yi had been waiting for Xiaosong to attack in anger. Only with such calculations could Zhang Yi have been able to use the White Goat hanging horn with both hands in such a short time. So Zhang Yi's pause and wait was not because of his soft and generous personality. Even at the end of the battle, Zhang Yi's close combat ability was even better than Xiaosong's. All of this caused the spectating students to realize that Zhang Yi was not as weak as they had imagined. He gave off such a feeling because he was humble and low-key. At this time, the student who had sneered and asked what Zhang Yi was waiting for, and then felt something was wrong because of Xiaosong's words before his counterattack, finally realized why he had felt something was wrong. Xiaosong had said that Zhang Yi was proud. But now, thinking back, from the start of the trials until now, even after defeating Xiaosong, who was ranked 11th on the Book of Talents, Zhang Yi only had an apologetic expression in his eyes. When had pride ever appeared on his face? From a certain point of view, Zhang Yi was not a hidden expert. The life bond sword that Xue Wangshu had left him could not be of decisive use. But the more so, all the spectating students felt inexplicably cold. Zhang Yi slowly put away the small sword in his left hand. Looking at Xiaosong, who was coughing up blood on the ground, he was very apologetic. In the end, he could not help but bow and say seriously, "Apologies, but I have never underestimated you. I never thought I could defeat you with one blow." Xiaosong clearly knew that Zhang Yi was sincerely apologizing, but at this moment, he felt even more ashamed and resentful. With a puff, he spat out another mouthful of blood. The strength of a group of people is more terrifying than the strength of one person, Jing Liuli said to Yintai Guanjin next to him. Then he looked towards the tent of palace attendant Rong and said with slight disdain, "Even sect Uncle Lin feels that this trial is becoming more interesting. I want to see how that person prepares to end it." While Ding Ning's side had Nangong Kaishu and Xiaoan withdraw from the trials, after Zhang Yi defeated Xiaosong, Ding Ning's side had become stronger. Seeing Zhang Yi walk back towards Ding Ning and the others, a rare smile appeared at the corners of Lin Suixin's mouth. Just like Jing Liuli said, he felt that this trial was becoming more interesting. So after Ding Ning defeated Zhou Wangyan in one blow and intimidated the crowd, he arranged for Nangong Kaishu, Zhang Yi, and Xiaoan to fight. This kind of arrangement naturally had some elements of purposefully suppressing the presence Ding Ning had created. The reason was because he wanted to see what method Ding Ning would use to recover the presence he had worked so hard to create. The battle between the two sides of the hut was no different from two armies fighting. What he wanted to see was Ding Ning's abilities as the commander. Now, not just Ding Ning, But even Zhang Yi and the others had shown abilities that surprised him. Since he had seen clearly, he naturally had to make some compensation to make this trial fairer. So without looking down at the scroll in his hand, he called out a name. Dugubai. At this time, many people were still in shock. When they heard these 3 words, another wave of heavy breathing sounded out like a tide. Facing Zhong Jingqiu, Lin Suixin casually flipped through the scroll and read the first name his gaze landed on. It is my turn to fight. Hearing the name of his opponent, Du Gubai only glanced at Ding Ning, Su Lianhua, and the others. He said calmly and started to walk towards Zhang Yi. Before the last trial started, he had focused on cutting many wooden swords. At this time, these wooden swords were piled on the ground by his feet like firewood. He didn't even bring these wooden swords with him. As for his opponent, a young man in blue, his face was as white as snow, and he was on the verge of crying. Du Gubai had never fought in Chongling, but when the Book of Talents came out, all the young geniuses of Chongling thought that Du Gubai would be first in the Book of Talents. While Liang Hong was first in the Book of Talents, in many people's minds, Du Gubai was still first. On the other hand, Zhong Jingqiu, who came from the Jade Toad Taoist Temple, was ranked below the 30th spot in the Book of Talents. Moreover, his left leg was injured, and even his movements were somewhat inconvenient. In anyone's eyes, this was a battle where the difference in strength was too great. Du Gubai and Zhang Yi nodded and bowed to each other. Then they continued to walk into the arena where Zhang Yi and Xia Song were fighting. Du Gubai muttered to himself for a moment as he looked at his opponent who was struggling to walk over with his sword and looked like he was about to cry. Then, he said, "You are heavily injured. I will only attack once. As long as you can receive one of my attacks, I will admit defeat." "Only one attack?" Gasps sounded. Zhong Jingqiu, who was about to cry, was stunned. He looked up in disbelief, a light of hope appearing in his eyes again. "This is too arrogant." Xiaowan couldn't help but frown and say. She did not doubt Du Gubai's strength. She was certain that Du Gubai usually had the power to casually defeat Zhong Jingqiu with one blow. But now that he had said this, Zhong Jingqiu did not have to think too much and just needed to focus on defense. While his injuries were not light, he would not have any problems in a defensive sword form filled with sword essence. In her view, Du Gubai's actions were too dangerous and unnecessary. He wants to attack the other side's morale. Hearing Xiaowan's words, Zhang Yi, who had just walked in front of her, explained softly and seriously, "Previously, my junior sect brother Ding Ning defeated Zhou Wangyan with one blow and caused the other side's morale to suffer a great blow. If he also defeats his opponent with one blow, the other side will be even more nervous. When the pressure is too great and they are too nervous, they will often make mistakes." These words were not hard to understand. Xia Wan's frown slowly relaxed. She looked at Zhang Yi's gentle face and nodded. She said, "Your junior sect brother is right. Zhang Yi, you are much stronger than we imagined." No. Zhang Yi's face immediately flushed and he shook his head. "Much stronger than we imagined. We have to add a condition, when you are not wishy-washy." Seeing Zhang Yi like this, Su Lianhua could not help but smile disdainfully. She snorted and said, "Truthfully, just now, I am surprised that you are not wishy-washy in your fight with Xia Song." Zhang Yi lowered his head in shame and said, "Earlier, junior sect brother reminded me, and it was Miss Xiaowan who allowed me to enter this round. If I lose because of my wishy-washy, how can I face Miss Xiaowan? So it is because of Xiaowan." Su Lianhua smiled. This. Zhang Yi stilled. He felt this was not right, but did not know how to explain. His face flushed red, but he could not speak. Xiaowan's face also flushed slightly, and she glared at Su Lianhua. Everyone knows that Du Gubai is strong, but how strong will depend on this blow. Su Lianhua turned her head, and her expression quickly became serious as she said in a deep voice. Xiaowan's attention was successfully diverted. Her eyes unconsciously contracted because at this time, Du Gubai was slowly pulling out his sword. Chapter 293. Du Gubai's sword was Du Gubai's sword. Xiaowan and the others knew when he had asked for guidance from Ding Ning, but the students on the other side of the hut did not know what sword Du Gubai used. When he started to draw his sword, these students held their breaths, wanting to see the true appearance of this sword immediately. But Dugu Bai's drawing was unusually slow. After many breaths, his sword had only been pulled out an inch, and a faint green light appeared at the edge of the scabbard. But at this time, all the students' breathing unconsciously sped up. At this time, Dugu Bai's entire right arm was flowing with visible threads of white vital energy. These threads of white vital energy gave off an unusually thick and domineering presence as they steadily poured into the sword hilt in his hand. Most of the sword was still in the scabbard, but it started to hum like the sound of a merchant ship moving on a river. As the vital energy continued to pour in, Dugu Bai's right hand was still as steady as a rock. The sword hilt moved slowly like before, but the sword struggled furiously in the scabbard. The layers of light flashing inside the scabbard were brighter than the part of the sword exposed outside the scabbard. Sensing Dugu Bai's domineering vital energy presence, Zhong Jingqiu found it harder to breathe. Beads of sweat dripped down from his brow. He did not know why Dugu Bai was pouring vital energy into the scabbard. He felt that the longer he waited, the more dangerous it was. Yet he did not dare to attack first. For him, his only hope was to use some targeted sword moves filled with sword essence when Dugu Bai's sword move formed. Dugu Bai's drawing was still extremely slow, but the scabbard at his waist was almost unable to contain the light inside the scabbard. The entire scabbard was almost transparent and started to crack. At this moment, Dugu Bai suddenly lifted his right foot and stomped heavily on the ground in front of him. The sword intent he had accumulated finally erupted at this moment. With a cracking sound, the sword in his right hand finally left the scabbard. Like a bolt of lightning, it pierced towards Zhong Jingqiu. Uncontrollable cries of shock rang out at the same time. There were no words to describe the speed of Dugu Bai's sword. The moment Dugu Bai drew his sword, the power accumulated in the scabbard formed a terrifying current of air along the opening of the scabbard. It pushed the tip of the sword out of the scabbard, and in that instant, it produced an astonishing propulsion force against the forward momentum of the sword. At the same time, the ground in front of Dugu Bai exploded. The power generated by his step gathered his true essence and heaven and earth origin energy into the new power generated by the sword hilt, perfectly fusing into this sword thrust. The sword drew an arc in the air. The tip of the sword was just a few feet away from Zhong Jingqiu, but there were visible sonic booms on both sides of the sword tip. However, what was even more shocking was that at the last moment when the sword tip left the scabbard, the lower edge of the sword tip cut the opening of the scabbard. Not only did it cause the scabbard to fly forward, the entire scabbard, under all of this, completely exploded like a heavenly maiden scattering flowers. The fragments of the scabbard shot out and flew in front of the sword. They were turned into even smaller fragments by the power coming from the sword. Each piece moved faster and faster, and in the end, they burned in the air and shot towards Zhong Jingqiu like countless small meteors with long trails of smoke. Zhong Jingqiu's eyes were completely filled by the smoke, and even the fear in her eyes was completely drowned out. He had been concentrating on preparing a defensive sword move. Yet when he saw Dugu Bai's sword, he still could not imagine what sword move he had that could block such a blow. At this moment, he clenched his teeth and curled up his body in a strange posture. The true essence in his body flowed into the long sword in front of his chest. Pieces of sparkling and translucent sword light overlapped in front of him, faintly forming a jade-like toad. The toad shadows formed by the sword lights were not large and could not even cover his entire body. But he did not have the extravagant hope that he could block all of the fragments of the scabbard. He only had the extravagant hope that he could block Dugu Bai's sword. He only had the extravagant hope that he could still stand after the fragments of the scabbard pierced through the non-fatal parts of his body. Because he only needed to support one blow. As long as he could still stand after Dugu Bai's blow, he could win. Many of the cultivators present were knowledgeable and powerful. They had accurate judgments of the power formed from vital energy and primal energies of the universe. Seeing Zhong Jingqiu use such a blow, many of them frowned deeply. They all felt that Zhong Jingqiu could withstand this blow. Even though many of the fragments would penetrate Zhong Jingqiu's body in the next moment, Zhong Jingqiu, who could protect the most important parts of his body, would not fall. However, At this moment, a scene that they had never imagined appeared. Dugu-bai pulled back his sword. Dugu-bai, who had been charging viciously, stopped and pulled back his sword. His right hand, which had been advancing at an astounding speed, pulled back inconceivably towards the scabbard at his waist that no longer existed. As he pulled back his sword, the air in front of the sword tip seemed to be sucked away, and a unique seal essence formed. Pew, 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 pew. Countless tiny waves seemed to appear in front of him. These tiny splashes were the traces of the cracks and sonic booms produced when the tiny fragments of the scabbard accelerated even more violently. At the same time, a series of fine popping sounds rang out. It was the sound of the fragments piercing through Zhong Jingqiu's swordlight, the jade toad-like phantom, and Zhong Jingqiu's flesh. The tiny waves were still blooming in the air, but the countless fragments of the scabbard had passed through Zhong Jingqiu's body and brought out countless tiny flowers of blood behind him. Zhong Jingqiu's eyes widened to their limits. His body felt as if it had been struck by lightning. All of his consciousness told him to stand still and raise his sword. However, the power that struck his body and the depths of his body did not allow his body to do so. His body uncontrollably flipped backwards and fell hard towards the ground. Cries of surprise and cries of swords rang out like a tide, accompanied by shouts of surprise and anger. Then there were many flashes of sword light in the darkness and many ear-piercing metal sounds. Dugu-bai stopped, covering his nose with his left hand to prevent himself from coughing violently from inhaling large amounts of dust. The shards of the scabbard even shot into the crowd of students behind Zhong Jingqiu. Some students were caught off guard and were wounded by the shards after drawing their swords. He did it on purpose? Looking at the chaotic scene on the other side of the hut and hearing the angry shouts, Exin, who had not spoken due to exhaustion, could not help but murmur softly to himself. Xiaowan was speechless. No one could say that Dugu-bai did it on purpose, but this scene appeared to be Dugu-bai attacking Zhong Jingqiu and everyone behind him. Zhang Yi was stunned. This? If you do something, do it thoroughly. This is the pride of the Dugu family. Su Lianhua sneered and turned to look at Zhang Yi. He said, "Learn more from Dugu-bai, and you will not be so wishy-washy." Dugu-bai calmly turned around as though he did not see anything. Then he walked towards Ding Ning and the others, still covering his nose with his left hand. But all the students on the other side of the hut could read his meaning from his back. Many people could not help but curse. Since they were not friends, then they were enemies. It was not a big deal to use the opportunity to kill them. In the darkness, Lin Suixin's eyes grew brighter. He felt more and more joy and found this trial more and more interesting. But at this time, hearing the curses, his brow furrowed in displeasure. The people of Min Mountain Sword Sect liked the most direct methods and were used to using the sword to speak. So most people of Min Mountain Sword Sect hated useless arguments and curses, especially Lin Suixin. His arrangements had always been casual. Because of his displeasure, his arrangements were even more casual now. So among the cursing people, he randomly picked a student and shouted a name. Ding Ning. Then he shouted the student's name. Yes, Gongmuyu. All the voices in the hall stopped abruptly. Zhang Yi looked in shock at Ding Ning and could not help but turn to look at Lin Suixin. Why is it me? After a moment of dead silence, an incredulous voice called out, I haven't even started the first round of the competition. Many people also came back to their senses, and their eyes fell on Lin Suixin. At this time, it was naturally Gong Muyu, the student he had called out. However, Gong Muyu had not even participated in a single match, so how could she directly face Ding Ning, who had already passed the first round? But facing these people's questioning gazes, Lin Suixin said coolly, You did not win the first round. In the darkness, Gong Muyu was stunned. The scene fell into silence once again. Everyone was speechless, but they could not question it. Because 45 students had passed the Sea of Brambles, someone would definitely win the first round. Winning the first round was the luckiest thing, but now, this student was arranged to face Ding Ning. Chapter 294. A cultivation teacher had an ugly expression. He was the teacher of the Donghao sword sect who had brought Gong Muyu to attend the Min Mountain sword trials. But his ugly expression was not because of Lin Suixin's random arrangements, but because of Gong Muyu's reaction. While Ding Ning had shown great combat power before, and his control of sword moves and timing was astounding, Gong Muyu's vital energy cultivation was slightly higher than Ding Ning's. In his eyes, there was a possibility of a fight. He would not panic when he heard that his opponent was Ding Ning. Also, only 45 students had passed the Sea of Brambles. Since Lin Suixin said that he would not have to fight in the first round, then if he could defeat Ding Ning, Gong Muyu could enter the top 12. If one could rank in the top 10, they would be allowed to enter Min Mountain Sword Sect to study. In the view of this Donghao Sword Sect elder, Gong Muyu had obtained an unprecedented opportunity. If he could grasp this opportunity, he could even change his fate. Yet, Gong Muyu's performance disappointed him. His heart turned cold before the battle. A cultivator like this could not become a truly powerful swordsman and would only be a stepping stone on other people's path to fame. Did you see it clearly? In the indescribable silence, Du Gubai walked in front of Ding Ning and the others. Looking at Ding Ning, who was preparing to fight, he nodded and asked. Ding Ning nodded calmly and said, I saw it clearly. Hearing the two's simple conversation, Zhang Yi's body unconsciously shook. He said in shock, Brother Dugu, so you just now, that sword. Du Gubai glanced at Zhang Yi and smiled in tacit agreement. Powerful. Su Lianhua frowned. She didn't want to admit it, but she had no choice but to admit it. Xiao Wan, Xie Rou, and the others at the side could not help but take a deep breath, admiration surging in their hearts again. They finally reacted. Just now, Du Gubai's attack was not just to show his power and express his attitude, but also to force all the students on the other side of the hut to use their swords to block. Attacking hastily without preparation could expose more. Du Gubai had done this, and Ding Ning had realized this long ago. He saw what he needed from this. Du Gubai and Ding Ning were undoubtedly two terrifying people. What made them feel fortunate and happy was that these two people were on their side. Ding Ning started to walk. Everyone's eyes once again converged on the silent wine shop youth. The imperceptible smile at the corners of Lin Suixin's mouth had disappeared, and he resumed his expressionless appearance. But when Ding Ning walked into the area marked out by the sword mark, he suddenly spoke and said slowly, the winner of this round will have a bye in the next round. What? Cries of surprise rang out like a tide. This time, the exclamations were even louder than when Du Gubai had unleashed that violent sword strike. How can it be like this? A student could not help but shout angrily. The winner of this round could enter the top 12. If they had a bye, they would enter the top 6 and obtain the right to enter Min Mountain Sword Sect to cultivate. Why not? Lin Suixin turned his head. He was still expressionless, but his eyes were slightly mocking. After the second round, not only will they have a bye, many people will have a bye. After a pause, he seemed to see what many people were thinking and said with slight disdain, Do you think I will let you first decide the top 6, and then arrange for the defeated to compete to decide the top 4? I don't have the time to watch the losers compete. Naturally, I will arrange the matches during the competition to find the final 10 winners. Hearing the word gather, many students grew even angrier, but no one dared to speak up and ask, because no one could change Lin Suixin's casual attitude. Who would be the next few people who would have a bye? They were all drawn by Lin Suixin. Lin Suixin could let anyone fight one more round. You do not even have the guts to express your anger. What right do you have to call yourself a disciple of Min Mountain Sword Sect? Lin Suixin expressionlessly shook his head as he looked at the candidates who were so angry their faces turned red but did not dare to speak. He said coldly in his mind. Then he turned and said to Ding Ning and Gong Muyu, You can start. Hearing Lin Suixin's words, Gong Muyu's face flushed a sickly red. While he was afraid of Ding Ning's strength, Lin Suixin's words stimulated him greatly. If he won this round, and just had to fight this round in the entire competition, he could obtain the right to enter Min Mountain Sword Sect to cultivate. Compared to Gong Muyu's excitement, Ding Ning was still absolutely calm. All he wanted was first place. Entering the top 10 earlier or later didn't make much of a difference to him. Since Lin Suixin wanted this competition to be more interesting, then he would make it more interesting. Please. So he raised the last flower remnant sword, and held it horizontally across his chest. He looked at Gong Muyu and said calmly. Gong Muyu hesitated slightly and then seemed to throw caution to the wind. With a howl, he drew his sword. His vital energy flowed into the golden scabbard through his left hand. Before his right hand touched the hilt, the entire sword jumped out of the scabbard. The scabbard of his sword was a blinding gold. The hilt was also gold, and the blade that jumped out of the scabbard was also a blinding gold. The body of the sword was covered in python patterns. This sword was the former sect master sword of the Han's Golden Python Palace, the Golden Python Sword. This sword was slightly larger than an ordinary sword, and walked the path of tyrannical power. After some hesitation at the start, in front of the huge temptation of directly entering the top 10, Gong Muyu was also stimulated to fight with his back against the wall. At the same time his right hand held onto the sword hilt, the true essence in his body instantly changed direction. From the left side of his body to the right side of his meridians, his body released a dull rumbling sound, and the sword in his hand surged with a golden light, and in his hand, it directly transformed into a blazing sun. This was one of the most powerful secret sword moves of the Donghao Sword Manual. Rising Sunday, the master of the Donghao Sword Sect's expression eased up slightly when he saw the sun rising from Gong Muyu's hand. At the very least, the sword intent in the attack was brimming, and there was nothing to nitpick about it. In his eyes, it was a very good choice to use the attack right now. Offense was the best defense. While this move was powerful, the sword essence was only rising slowly. The power was not used up, and there was always room to maneuver. However, in the next moment, this teacher from the Donghao Sword Sect and many other teachers from other cultivation places were completely shocked, because Ding Ning had already drawn his sword. As he swung the last flower remnant sword forward, a patch of fine sword light burned like wildfire. Even Zhang Yi's eyes were wide in shock. He did not understand what his little sect brother was doing. What Ding Ning was using was a move of the Wildfire Sword Manual, Wildfire Prairie. This move was naturally a sword move with dense sword presence and strong defensive power, but everyone could clearly sense that Ding Ning's vital energy was slightly weaker than Gong Muyu's. Such an ordinary sword move would not be able to block Gong Muyu's sword. A clear and melodious sound of collision rang out. The sun-like sword light and the dense wildfire reflected off each other. The two swords had officially collided. Gong Muyu's eyes were filled with incomprehension. The feeling of impact that passed along the blade to the hilt clearly reminded him of the difference in power between the two swords. Ding Ning could not stop his attack, but since he could not, why did Ding Ning choose such a sword move? Was it just an error in judgment? Was Ding Ning's abilities deified because of his previous performance, and he actually did not have such great abilities? Gong Muyu could not understand it all, but Ding Ning could not change any sword moves in time. Every tiny fiber in his body was trembling, wanting him to stab his sword into Ding Ning's chest. His breathing stopped completely. The sword in his hand burned with more light as he charged forward. In the narrow space, there were several crisp sounds of metal clashing. Ding Ning's remnant sword could not stop the power of the Golden Python Sword. It was knocked to the side. The powerful impact caused his body to become unsteady, and he took 2 steps back. Gong Muyu's sword essence had reached its peak. The tip of his sword stabbed through the afterimage of Ding Ning's remnant sword and was about to stab into Ding Ning's chest. However, at this moment, everyone's hearts surged with a feeling of disbelief and ridicule. Because at this time, the crimson worm that had been curled up behind Ding Ning was lifted up by Ding Ning's foot as he retreated. Then Ding Ning's left hand landed on its neck, and as if he was holding a sword, he grabbed its head and swung it towards Gong Muyu's sword. This black ice worm had not expected such a thing to happen. Sensing the sharp sword essence coming at it, it trembled in fear. Almost instinctively, it spat out the power it had accumulated in its body. Gong Muyu's breathing completely stopped. His body froze. Poof! He saw the crimson worm spit out a stream of cold air, rushing towards his sword. The power of this cold stream was not strong to him, but most of the power in his sword had been destroyed by Ding Ning's sword moves. The sword essence had reached its end, and could not produce any more power. So he could not stop it. He was shocked to see that his sword was being pushed upwards. A power he could not resist came and caused his sword-wielding arm to rise. Crack! There was the sound of ice forming in the air. The cold stream that had knocked away his sword formed a glowing icicle in the air. Ding Ning calmly grabbed the crimson worm and continued to move forward. This icicle stabbed into Gong Muyu's chest. Hot blood spurted out along the edges of the icicle. Everyone stilled. Even Lin Suixin stilled. He had not expected such a scene. Chapter 295. Gong Muyu was even more incredulous. He looked at Ding Ning's calm features and the crimson long worm in Ding Ning's hand. His heart was filled with a sense of absurdity. Yet when he heard the hissing sounds of his blood rubbing against the edges of the icicles, and felt that the power in his body seemed to be instantly sucked out, his sense of absurdity was quickly replaced by terror. He gave an unusually shrill scream. As he screamed, Ding Ning had taken multiple steps back. The hot blood melted the remaining icicles in Gong Muyu's body, but not a drop of blood landed on Ding Ning. With a soft pop, Gong Muyu's gold python sword fell from his hand and stabbed powerlessly into the ground in front of him. As his body fell backwards, a Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator appeared next to him, put a hand on his back, and started to apply medicine to stop the bleeding. The loss of the sword and the intervention of the Min Mountain cultivators meant the end of this battle. Gong Muyu's scream still echoed in everyone's ears. Looking at Ding Ning, who calmly put away his sword and bent down to put down the deep red black ice worm, Su Lianhua refocused and shook his head self-deprecatingly. He said, "It is still just a sword. But is this a sword or a worm?" Su Lianhua's voice was not low. In the silence, almost everyone heard him. More students recovered from their daze. Is this not against the rules? A student could not help but shout, "Idiot!" Hearing the students shout, Su Lianhua sneered in disdain. How is it against the rules? Lin Suixin looked with interest at Su Lianhua and the student but did not speak. The student stilled. He looked at the deep red worm behind Ding Ning and did not know what to say. Su Lianhua looked even more disdainfully at the student and said disdainfully, "If you have the ability, you can also catch a few of these insects from the previous event and then have them follow you obediently. Then you can use them as swords to stab your opponent." Seeing the student's face grow paler and his lips tremble, Zhang Yi coughed softly, hoping that Su Lianhua would stop speaking and leave some face for the student. But Su Lianhua did not stop there. He sneered and said, "If you are more capable, you can have that large army of insects work for you. At that time, if you bring out a group of insects like that, I fear there will be no need to fight in this sword competition. You will definitely be first." Hearing Su Lianhua's merciless mockery, many students on the other side of the hut were furious. Yet, they could not find any words to argue. The key to Ding Ning's victory did not lie in using the black ice worm's power. The key was that he could possess this black ice worm and use it like a sword. The key was that he could so accurately determine that Gong Muyu's remaining power was weaker than the black ice worm's after his sword had worn away part of its power. The key was that he could do this smoothly and precisely at the right time. Now, the more they thought about Ding Ning's sword or the final scene of victory with the worm, the more these students felt Ding Ning's terror, the more they felt that Ding Ning was at ease. They even felt that all of this was within Ding Ning's expectations and control. The Donghao Sword Sect teacher's anger had completely disappeared and turned into respect for Ding Ning. In his view, no matter how hard Gong Muyu worked, he could not be a match for Ding Ning in this battle. He had never seen a youth as terrifying as Ding Ning, or as terrifying as Ding Ning's talent. No more questions? Lin Suixin looked at the student who had his head bowed. He gave a rare faint smile and said, "Then continue." Hearing Lin Suixin's casual words, many people couldn't help but almost groan in pain. They thought of what Lin Suixin had said at the start. They thought of how Ding Ning had entered the top 10 of the Min Mountain Sword Trials after winning this battle. Even with Palace Attendant Rong's public revolt, even with their obstruction, Ding Ning still became the first student to enter the top 10, and the first student to qualify to enter Min Mountain Sword Sect to cultivate. In a certain shadow on the mountain path, the yellow-robed middle-aged man who had been reporting to Palace Attendant Rong was dazed for a moment. He had not expected Ding Ning to reach this step, It was a great honor for White Goat Cave for a cultivator like Ding Ning to enter the top 10. Yet looking at Ding Ning's back as he silently walked back, he knew this wine shop youth would not stop here. But can you really succeed? Complicated emotions appeared in the yellow-robed middle-aged man's eyes. In the resting tent, palace attendant Rong could clearly see everything happening in the mountain valley. She did not need the yellow-robed middle-aged man's constant reports. At this time, many people in the mountain valley were thinking that she would be angry at Ding Ning entering the top 10 first. Yet, they had not expected that palace attendant Rong's cold face only had a hint of disdain. Just a child's play. She watched as Ding Ning calmly walked back to Zhang Yi and the others, and then looked at Su Lianhua's disdain towards that student. She said coldly to herself, these were her heartfelt words. In her view, no matter how outstanding these young people's performance and talent were, compared to the power of the adult world, they were just child's play. On another cliff opposite her, Fu Su's figure trembled as he looked at Ding Ning and the deep red worm behind Ding Ning. He was worried and sad, but also happy for Ding Ning. On another cliff, Pan Rui turned to look at Huang Jinwei, whose eyes were filled with emotion, and said, "Why didn't you say great this time?" Huang Jinwei smiled with slight embarrassment and said, "If I say good things 3 times, they become naggy." Exian. In the mountain valley, Lin Suixin's voice sounded again. Everyone held their breaths again. Regardless of which side Exian belonged to, he, ranked 7th on the Book of Talents, was an important person who could influence who won in the end. Many students facing Ding Ning and the others tensed up in fear of hearing their names. Bye. Lin Suixin's gaze imperceptibly flashed across their bodies, and then he expressionlessly said. The bodies of these students immediately relaxed. Exian, still bye. However, to everyone's surprise, Lin Suixin calmly said this. An uproar. Even though they knew that they wouldn't get any answers by interrogating someone like Lin Suixin, some of the players couldn't help but cry out in anger. How can there be 2 consecutive empty rounds? That's right. Why not? Lin Suixin looked casually at the students and said emotionlessly, if you have objections, I can give you a chance. I can have Exian not buy, as long as one of you is willing to face Exian. The students trembled in anger. The swords in their scabbards gave off clear vibrations, but no one dared to respond. Even if they thought they could fight an expert like Exian, no one was willing to fight an opponent like Exian. Since some people are going to be buys in the end, as the final examiner of Min Mountain Sword Sect, I cannot choose suitable people to be buys. Then there is no difference between having my eyes open and being blind. Lin Suixin looked emotionlessly at the students. He turned around and said with slight disdain, you are not willing to face Exian. This is a wise action at this time. But you do not even have this bit of courage and bravery. Do you expect me to arrange for you to be buys? Hearing these words, many people were so angry they could not breathe easily. But even the cultivation teachers did not feel that Lin Suixin's actions were unfair. Even they felt that these students were far inferior to Exian, and even Nangong Kaishu and Xiaowan, who had been eliminated. Chapter 296. Su Lianhua. Turning around, Lin Suixin glanced at where Ding Ning and the others were. Without looking at the scroll in his hand, he called out Su Lianhua's name. Many students gritted their teeth. They increasingly felt that Lin Suixin was purposefully sending Ding Ning's side into the top 10. But to their surprise, Lin Suixin said another name. Against by ruse. So casual. Hearing Lin Suixin announce his opponent's name, Su Lianhua shook his head and muttered with a frown. He could not understand Lin Suixin's thoughts. From the previous details, anyone could sense that Lin Suixin admired those who stood on Ding Ning's side more. But Lin Suixin's present arrangements seemed to be leaning towards eliminating him. Bai Ruse was ranked 22nd on the Book of Talents, the most outstanding youth of the Du Sword School. If they had met at a normal time, Su Lianhua had an 80% chance of defeating him. But Su Lianhua was at the end of his rope after defeating Chen Liqiu. Bai Ruse had not been wounded at all, and had easily defeated his first opponent. Do you feel that Bai Ruse is better than me? While he could not understand, Su Lianhua did not want to argue with Lin Suixin. He stood up with difficulty and started to walk slowly. How are you? Zhang Yi could not help but follow closely. He looked worriedly at Su Lianhua and said hesitantly, "If you really cannot do it, do not force it. I do not want to answer you." Su Lianhua glanced at Zhang Yi and then turned to Xiaowan. "Xiaowan, answer what the cultivators of the Su Marquisate establishment are like." Zhang Yi turned to look in shock at Xiaowan. Xiaowan took a deep breath and said softly, "The Su Marquisate establishment only has cultivators who die in battle and never cultivators who admit defeat." Zhang Yi was stunned and speechless. Ding Ning stopped not too far away from Zhang Yi. Looking at Su Lianhua walking towards him, he didn't make a sound. It was only when Su Lianhua passed by him that he said softly, 3 inches below your left ribs." Su Lianhua raised her eyebrows slightly, but she didn't say anything and continued forward. Bai Ruse was already waiting in the field. Seeing Su Lianhua stop in front of him, he bowed and said apologetically, "I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize to me." However, looking at the extremely polite Bai Ruse, Su Lianhua's face stiffened. Her voice was slightly cold as she said, "Do you think that I will definitely lose to you?" Bai Ruse had just straightened his body when he heard these words. His expression stiffened, and he bowed slightly, saying, "I'm sorry." He apologized twice in a row, and his attitude was very sincere. However, he was the most outstanding disciple of a cultivation place, so he was usually extremely proud. At this moment, although his expression was respectful, the flames of anger also flashed in the depths of his eyes. Su Lianhua did not look at him. She only raised her head to look at the dark sky that seemed to even cover the stars. She said expressionlessly, "Let's begin." Bai Ruse did not hesitate or say anything. He knew that he was very close to the top 10 of the trials. He would not miss a chance to change his life because of some emotional factors. Just as Su Lianhua's voice sounded, he attacked. With a soft clang, the green sharkskin sheath on his left side was empty. His right hand had finished a sword swing. In the air between him and Su Lianhua, there were no rampaging primal energies of the universe, only a dozen faint blue sword shadows. These 10 or so dark blue sword shadows were like phantoms swimming in the deep sea. They silently moved forward in a strange, spiral pattern in the air, stabbing towards various vital points on Su Lianhua's body. Su Lianhua's eyes narrowed. His hand quickly pulled out his sword. A light pink sword light spun around him. Swaths of sword energy rose from the ground around him like lotus petals. The dozen blue sword shadows collided with the petals like ghosts, but were bounced off, giving off balls of blue smoke. They were unable to get within a foot of Su Lianhua. Seeing this scene, Bai Ruse let out a fierce howl as a vicious expression appeared on his handsome face. His toes touched the ground, and his body seemed to float weightlessly. The blue longsword in his hand slashed down towards Su Lianhua's head. As his sword light slashed down, countless wisps of blue energy floated up from the ground below the sword light and gathered towards the sword. These countless wisps of blue energy exuded a special cold aura, completely unlike the aura of the mortal world. They rose from the ground without making a sound. The scene of countless wisps of energy rising from the ground at the same time was like countless flowers blooming from the netherworld. The blood vessels on Su Lianhua's forehead bulged and jumped. Then he shook his head, sighed, and released the sword in his hand. Almost everyone thought that Su Lianhua was going to give up, but Zhang Yi knew this was not the case. So he could see more clearly than most people that Su Lianhua's hand was moving towards the scabbard at his waist. There was a muffled boom. The air around Su Lianhua's scabbard suddenly exploded. For a moment, Bai Ruse had thought that Su Lianhua was going to give up. But when he sensed Su Lianhua's berserk presence, his pupils contracted and he could not help but howl again. The blue energy gathered on his sword started to condense. It was like a blue ghost was about to charge out of his sword. But at this time, Su Lianhua's hand reached out. Su Lianhua held the scabbard and stabbed at the blue long sword in his hand. Bai Ruse's breathing completely stopped. He did his best to adjust the direction of his long sword, but he found that Su Lianhua's movements were much faster than his. With a soft clang, Su Lianhua, with narrowed eyes, accurately used his scabbard to catch Bai Ruse's long sword. The sword returned to the scabbard, and countless threads of blue energy flooded out of the scabbard. The blue ghost formed by the sword seemed to be crushed. Even more importantly, the scabbard cut off the connection between the longsword and the primal energies of the universe. It seemed to have cut off many seal lines connected to the sword. Bairu's heart grew cold, but he was not weak. The moment his sword move was stopped, he naturally responded. He retreated and pulled out his sword. At the same time, he increased the output of his vital energy. He wanted to use this moment of stalemate to injure Su Lianhua even more and cause her to lose. However, it was also at this moment that his heart was filled with disbelief. An irresistible force came from the sword hilt in his hand. How can there be such great power? His eyes widened to their limits. He opened his mouth, but before he could say anything, Su Lianhua had already waved her arm. The scabbard directly carried his sword, and with that unreasonable power, it whipped towards his left rib like an iron whip. Bairu's body subconsciously wanted to twist and dodge, but a wave of pain prevented his body from dodging as fast as he expected. Bam! A muffled knocking sound reverberated in everyone's ears, covering the many fine sounds of bones breaking in the next moment. Bairu's vomited blood from his open mouth. His body arched, and he flew backwards like he had snapped, falling to the ground dozens of feet away. How can it be like this? Some cultivation teachers exclaimed in disbelief. The cultivators who were more aware of vital energy were more shocked. In the final stage of this battle, Su Lianhua had used pure power to defeat Bairu's. In their view, Su Lianhua could not have used such overwhelming power against Bairu's. Bairu's cultivation was just a bit lower than his. He actually, however, in the next moment, all these cultivation teachers who felt it was inconceivable all knew the answer. Their gazes gathered on Su Lianhua's face in shock. Su Lianhua stood motionless, but his face seemed to be wearing a multicolored mask. His facial features were distorted from the pain, and even his muscles were twitching. He did not care about the poison in his body. Some students reacted and shouted in disbelief. Zhang Yi was stunned. His body uncontrollably trembled. Ding Ning and Gung Rin had carefully explained the power of the seven-leaf powder, so he knew how painful it would be if he did not care about the limits and used all his vital energy. But Su Lianhua was still standing. What made Zhang Yi's body tremble even more was that not only was Su Lianhua standing still, she was also able to speak. This was because Su Lianhua's voice had already sounded. He has fallen. I am standing, so I should have won. Su Lianhua's voice had completely changed. It sounded like his voice was convulsing, but he was still speaking. Hearing this, Lin Suixin narrowed his eyes slightly. He nodded and spat out an unusually simple word. Yes. Almost everyone was so shocked they could not speak. But at this time, Ding Ning's expression was still calm. He looked at Su Lianhua's convulsing body and said, "You should not have needed 2 moves, just 1 sword. This is my problem." Su Lianhua could no longer turn around, but his distorted voice still rang out. "But it's not that I'm doubting you, but I know that this poison must be very painful. I'm also a little afraid of the pain brought by this poison, so I even fantasized about not using this method to endure it." After saying this, Su Lianhua fell forward. Junior sect brother. Looking at the fallen Su Lianhua, Zhang Yi almost cried. He is already like this, and you still speak so much to him. Since I am going to do it, I will do it to the extreme. This way, I will not waste his efforts. Ding Ning looked at the fallen Su Lianhua and said calmly. Then he said seriously, pain is also an experience. Chapter 297. How long did I last? Looking at the fallen Su Lianhua, Jing Liili turned to ask Yantai Guanjian with a cold expression. Yantai Guanjian thought carefully and said, he also said a few words, but thinking about it, it should be shorter than his words. Jing Liili was silent for a moment and said, this sword trial was not bad. Yantai Guanjian naturally understood that she was not praising the sword trial he had arranged. He smiled faintly and said, while the pain he endured surpassed you, you were not as hesitant as he was at the time. Jing Liili shook her head and said coldly, surpassing is surpassing in one matter. If 2 people are poisoned by this poison, and he can last longer, and make one more attack than me, I will die. Yintai Guanjin knew that he could not convince Jing Lieli on this matter. He couldn't help but sigh. Maybe because you are so serious about everything and compete with others in every aspect, you are the genius who has improved the fastest in Min Mountain Sword Sect's history, maybe in the past, but maybe not in the future. Jing Lieli looked at Ding Ning, who was talking to Zhang Yi. She slowly looked up at the sky, her black eyes seeming to merge into the night. Before this, she had seen countless young geniuses, but none of them could make her feel pressure. Therefore, even though she strived to excel in everything, her life was actually not hard at all. Now, there was finally someone who could make her tremble from the bottom of her heart. When she felt a pressure she had never felt before, it was as if she had seen a whole new world. She was certain that her cultivation would progress faster than in the past. Pain is also an experience. Ding Ning's words were unusually light, but in Xiaowan's ears, they had a completely different meaning. She looked up and looked respectfully at Ding Ning's profile. In her previous cultivation, only some of her teacher's words could make her feel the same way. He was a student like her, but Ding Ning's abilities made her feel that he was not like her. She took a deep breath and began to circulate the true essence within her body. A firm and powerful aura quickly spread out from the surface of her skin. A whirlwind visible to the naked eye appeared around her. Zhang Yi, who was still grieving, suddenly turned around. What he saw shocked him so much that he was speechless. The students further away also noticed the abnormality on Xiaowan's side. Gasps of disbelief sounded. Mottled colors appeared on Xiaowan's face. Her exquisite features twisted together in pain, and her body started to tremble uncontrollably. "What are you doing?" Zhang Yi was finally able to make a sound. He cried out in grief and confusion. Ding Ning is right. Xiaowan found it hard to speak, but she still made a sound. I think that after experiencing this kind of pain, at least this kind of pain will be easier to endure. At the side, Dugu Bai and Exian had guessed the answer. But when they heard Xiaowan's voice, they were still shocked. No wonder this seemingly gentle young woman was ranked so high on the Book of Talents. Jing Lieli, who was closer to Ding Ning and the others than the students on the other side of the hut, reacted faster than the other students to what Xiaowan had done. I underestimated her. She frowned slightly, but her tone was emotionless. At this time, another similar presence exploded behind Ding Ning and caused her to pause. This similar presence came from Nangong Caishu's body. Looking at Nangong Caishu, who was also channeling her true essence and forcing the poison into great pain, Zhang Yi said in a trembling voice, his mind blank, "Even if you want to treat this as cultivation, you can wait until the trials are over." Unable to change the reality in front of him, he could only worry that they would lose consciousness and receive treatment from Min Mountain Sword Sect. He would not be able to see the following trials. I cultivate the plain mind sword. The sword that follows the heart is the fastest sword. Once I have a thought, I will do it. Xiaowan looked at him. Before she fell backwards, she slowly and laboriously finished the sentence. Hearing this, Jing Lieli slowly raised an eyebrow and said, "She does not need to come to Min Mountain Sword Sect to cultivate." Yintai Guanjian nodded solemnly. This time, he agreed with Jing Lieli's opinion. Are these people crazy? Seeing Nangong Caishu channel her true essence poison, a pale-faced student on the other side of the hut could not help but speak. Xiaowan and Nangong Caishu were both students who had been eliminated. Yet their actions put great pressure on the students on the other side of the hut. If they want to be like normal people, why are they cultivators? Yi Haoran frowned slightly. He looked at the pale-faced student next to him, and then at the other students who were also pale and sweating. He knew that these people were like wounded soldiers on the battlefield and would not have much effect on the final results of the trials. So while he knew that if he spoke, he would be able to boost the morale of these people, since there was not much meaning, he maintained his silence. His furrowed brows relaxed after a breath. Then his calm gaze swept across many people's faces. Just like Ding Ning, he was searching for the last crucial person. But even now, he had not found the last chess piece the mistress of Chongling had buried. Like the secluded Min Mountain Sword Sect was holding a sword trials that would affect the world, countless people in Chongling who were also shrouded in darkness could not sleep. In the cold wine shop of Falling Parasol, Zhang Sun Qianxue slowly opened her eyes. At this time, the streets of Falling Parasol were silent, but in her ears, she could hear the clear sound of footsteps. Someone walked from the distant alleys towards this wine shop. She stood up and walked towards the front yard like a silent breeze in the night, but the coldness and murderousness in her eyes grew colder. This was a cultivator with a scent that she was familiar with. With her current cultivation, she was more than 80% confident that she could kill this cultivator. However, she was also certain that she could not kill this cultivator quickly. At the very least, she could not kill this cultivator without being detected. If a situation appeared where she had to kill this cultivator, she could escape Chongling through the path marked on Ding Ning's wall. When Ding Ning was attending the trials, she had chosen to live here and not in Ink Garden because the paths Ding Ning had left on the wall all started from here. Escaping from here was the best chance of success. Even more importantly, Ding Ning was still attending the Min Mountain Sword trials. If she was exposed, Ding Ning would not be able to survive. The water in the small yard suddenly grew thicker. A glowing drop of water silently fell from the air towards the small flower bed in the yard. Zhang Sun Qianxue had lifted the curtain and walked into the front yard. Her figure suddenly stopped, and then she turned and walked back into the yard. A layer of frost covered her perfect face. As the water dropped into the soil, a white figure was standing in the yard. I was wondering who it was. So it really is eldest Miss Gongsun. But I had never thought that the eldest miss of the Gongsun family would be so beautiful. I pity her. I had never thought that the eldest miss of the Gongsun family would live in a place like this. A voice filled with emotion rang out. The voice was soft and firmly locked onto the small courtyard. However, the soft voice naturally carried an unruly and insufferably arrogant aura. Only a true great rebel would have such an aura. Naturally, only Bai Shanshui of the Cloud Water Palace could have such an imposing aura with her qi as vast as a river. Do you want to die or live? Zhang Sun Qianxue asked coldly as she looked at Bai Shanshui, who was standing under the eaves and leisurely surveying the yard. Bai Shanshui stilled slightly. She could not get used to Zhang Sun Qianxue's way of speaking, but she still smiled slightly and said seriously, I want to live. Zhang Sun Qianxue glanced at her. The coldness and murderousness in her eyes did not disappear. She waited for her to speak. Originally, I just wanted to see Ding Ning, but thinking that you are the person who killed my senior sect brother, I felt I should see you first. Bai Shanshui put her hands behind her back. Since even you can live here with that person's disciple, I did not come here to seek revenge, but to tell you that I can as well. Zhang Sun Qianxue did not waste effort to think how Bai Shanshui had discovered her and Ding Ning's identities. Her expression grew colder. She shook her head and said, I am not like you. I know. Bai Shanshui smiled and then quickly put away her smile. She said, but we have a common enemy. Zhang Sun Qianxue was silent for a moment and said, I am not responsible for thinking about these things. Bai Shanshui stilled again and then calmed down. She said, if that is the case, then wait for the trials to end and Ding Ning to come out. The actions of a great rebel naturally had a demeanor that mortals could not match. Bai Shanshui was not a match for Zhang Sun Qianxue at this time. Her life was hanging by a thread, but she ignored it completely. As she spoke, she floated out of the courtyard. In the end, she could not help but say, after this trial, Ding Ning's name will be known to the world, but no one will think that he is that person's disciple. Chapter 298. Bai Shanshui's voice was extremely soft like summer insects. Zhang Sun Qianxue heard her clearly. She did not speak, but the coldness in her eyes grew. The weeds on the walls behind Bai Shanshui suddenly became covered in white frost. Then they were blown away by the dry summer wind. This represented Zhang Sun Qianxue's true murderousness and power. Bai Shanshui felt true coldness. She adjusted her collar, but her expression did not change. She walked calmly and arrogantly through the dark streets of Chongling. Even if she was a ghost who had lost her country and lost her home, she was still a proud ghost as she wandered through Chongling. Bai Shanshui slowly looked up, but her proud eyes started to show an unusual emotion. Her brows furrowed. Her vision was blocked by the overlapping streets of Chongling in the darkness. She could not see very far, but there was the smell of smoke in the wind. There should be a house burning in the distance. She was certain that the place burning was the street where her inn was located. She had originally wanted to walk back to that street. Now that she was certain the smell of smoke was coming from there, she decisively turned towards another street, towards the exit of the city. In falling parasol, Zhang Sun Qinxue lay back down on the bed. She was used to not thinking about other matters. Yet the peace of many years was finally broken. There seemed to be pebbles in the calm lake in her heart that created waves. After dozens of breaths of rest, she still could not calm down. She finally tilted her head to look out the window. She wondered angrily when the trials would end. The night continued. The Min Mountain Sword trials continued. But in the mountain valley filled with sword marks and many cultivation teachers, there were fewer students who could stand. Xiero Bai. While he knew there was no use in asking questions, when he heard Lin Suixin's voice, a student who had been wounded in the chest and waist, and had just received medicine from a Min Mountain Sword sect cultivator, could not help but shout angrily. This is not fair. I fought 3 rounds, but she entered the top 10 in 1 round. Looking at this student who had lost in the 3rd round and had no chance of entering the top 10, Lin Suixin looked coolly at him and said, In reality, you should thank Gentleman Su. This student and many other students stilled, not understanding the meaning of Lin Suixin's words. At the exit of the previous round, the person who more or less spoke to each of you was Su Junzi. Lin Suixin did not look at the students' expressions and said slowly. Many students started to realize something, and their faces paled. Zhang Yi was even more confused when he saw their reactions. He couldn't help but turn to look at Ding Ning and the others. He asked softly, Who is Su Junzi? He is not surnamed Su like me, but originally from the Su lands. Su Lianhua took a deep breath and looked at Zhang Yi. He said, Not many people know his true name, but I think you should have heard of the story of cutting flesh to serve one's relatives. The elder at the exit of the previous round was... Zhang Yi was so shocked he could not speak. The Su lands had a gentleman who was courteous and righteous, and did many good deeds. One year, there was a great drought, and the Su lands had no harvest. That person had given away all his wealth. One day, many starving people smelled the fragrance of meat in that person's home and were furious. They thought that this person was a hypocrite who had given away his granary but still had meat in his home. In their fury, they knocked on the door and found the truth that made them cry. That person's granary had been empty for a long time, and his parents had not eaten for many days. In order to save his parents, that person had cut off his own flesh to make soup. Such deeds were naturally recorded in many history books. For some people who were courteous and righteous, that gentleman of the Su lands could be called a saint. But Zhang Yi had not expected that person to be a disciple of Min Mountain Sword sect, or that the person standing at the entrance of the Sea of Thorns was this gentleman of the Su lands. Your Bittervine Sword Mountain's most likely candidate to participate in the Min Mountain Sword Trials was not you, but your junior sect brother Qi Chiohan. Other people do not know why Qi Chiohan's progress has not been as good as yours, but do you not know? Looking at the student whose face was ashen and whose robes were soaked in sweat, Lin Suixin said expressionlessly, Min Mountain Sword sect has its own considerations for every student who participates in the trials. Before the last trial, Gentleman Su looked at your character. If he did not feel that you had room to change, you would not have appeared here. Now, he has allowed you to participate in the last trial and only let you fight 1 more round. You did not take the last chance. What else do you have to say? The student was trembling in shame. He didn't even dare to raise his head, much less say anything. Some students who had been arranged for 1 more round, or had not been given a bye, thought of some of the things they had done in the past. Sweat poured down their backs, and they did not dare to look at Lin Suixin. The Min Mountain Sword Trials is a trial for Min Mountain Sword sect to choose students. Lin Suixin did not stop speaking. His emotionless gaze swept across everyone, and he slowly said, Any process is to choose the most suitable students for Min Mountain Sword sect to enter the sect to cultivate. The scene quieted down again, but after a few breaths, the sound of footsteps rang out. A yellow-robed youth walked out a few steps and bowed to Lin Suixin. He said in a deep voice, I, Xiao Qinglin, believe that my conduct in the past has not been improper. My conduct is upright, and I feel that my cultivation is not weaker than Sierro's. However, I still have to fight one more battle than Sierro. Even in comparison, I still feel that the trials are unfair. Even from the angle of choosing for the sect, I do not feel that I am inferior to Sierro. Lin Suixing glanced at him and said, She is much richer than you. The yellow-robed youth shook, his face pale. The surrounding students were in an uproar. They had not expected Lin Suixing to say such a thing. But Lin Suixing did not seem to see their reaction and continued emotionlessly. Min Mountain Sword Sect has many cultivation methods that waste money. Only people like her can bear them. So if a cultivator like her can enter Min Mountain Sword Sect to study, her future accomplishments will be greater than yours. The yellow-robed youth stilled and reacted. There are many reasons that affect a cultivator's future. The Xie family is wealthy. She is braver than you. Her friends are much stronger than your friends. Of course, nothing is absolute. But considering all the factors, she is better than you. Lin Suixing glanced at him, and then looked at the students who just now were in an uproar but could not speak. He said coolly, Min Mountain Sword Sect never considers a student's family background, only their cultivation methods. You still have one last battle. Lin Suixing's gaze finally stopped on the yellow-robed youth and said, Xiao Qinglin against Exine. This yellow-robed youth called Xiao Qinglin understood the meaning in Lin Suixing's words. This was his last chance to enter Min Mountain Sword Sect to study. As long as he could defeat Exine and display abilities that would make these Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivators look at him in a different light. But did he have such abilities? The more he understood, the more hopeless he felt. Palace attendant Rong stood in front of the resting tent and looked at the valley below. There were still many battles, but looking at the remaining students, these battles were over in her eyes. Ding Ning, Exine, Zhang Yi, Sierro, He Zhaoxi, Yi Haoran, Ku Shichuan, Du Gubai, Li Shixing. Her lips curled slightly as she read out the names. Suddenly, she paused and shock flashed through her eyes. The top 10 of the trials would qualify to enter Min Mountain Sword Sect to study. But according to Lin Suixing's arrangements, after these battles, there would only be 9 people left. While Lin Suixing was casual, a person like him could instantly calculate the paths of thousands of swords. If he said he would arrange for 10 people to enter the final battle, he could not be wrong. Then who was the last person that was left empty? As the number of students decreased, the teachers of the cultivation places had complicated gazes. Previously, Ding Ning had been in the minority, but now, he was in the majority. While they knew that courage was only one of Lin Suixing's standards, and that Ding Ning's people were able to reach the end mostly due to their own strength, many teachers of cultivation places could not help but think about what would have happened if their students had stood on Ding Ning's side. Yi Haoran put away his sword and turned around. His opponent, a student dressed in blue robes, covered his throat in shock and fury, but did not dare to make a sound. There was a thin line of blood on his throat that kept on giving off beads of blood. On the other side, He Zhaoxi, who had fought with his opponent for 15 minutes before winning through physical strength, struggled to walk towards Ding Ning and the others. Why are there only 9 people? With Yi Haoran's victory, some teachers of cultivation places found the problem that Palace attendant Rong had discovered long ago and could not help but exclaim in shock. Chapter 299. Lin Suixing's arrangements were casual, but from the entire process of his arrangements, including the words he said to the students, most of the cultivation teachers found a pattern, or rather, strict rule. Before the Min Mountain Sword trial started, Min Mountain Sword Sect had clearly done a detailed investigation of each student, not just limited to their talent and cultivation, but also their past conduct. In the previous rounds, Lin Suixing had a comprehensive evaluation of the students' performance. Students who were weaker in talent and cultivation and had problems in their past conduct would be arranged for 1 or 2 more fights in the last trial. This seemed unfair, but it was the last chance the Min Mountain Sword trials gave them. If they could win 1 or 2 more fights and enter the top 10, they would have a chance to enter Min Mountain Sword Sect to cultivate. This Min Mountain Sword Trials was not a competition to win fame, but a way for Min Mountain Sword Sect to choose their disciples. Based on the pattern Lin Suixin showed, or rather, the strict rules, most of the cultivation teachers could see that other than Ding Ning, Zhang Yi, Yi Xian and the others who had entered the top 10, Yi Haoran, Ku Shichuan and the others, the last fight should be between He Xiaoxi and another student, Lu Qiga from Morning Dew Sword School. At this time, He Xiaoxi was exhausted, and his energy and vital energy had been greatly expended. But Lu Qiga's situation was even more difficult. This youth ranked past 40 on the Book of Talents had broken his left arm after enduring the previous fight. He had more than 10 bleeding wounds on his body and was extremely weak due to the great loss of blood. In everyone's view, the winner of this last fight should be He Xiaoxi. But counting He Xiaoxi, there was still one student missing from the top 10. Had Lu Qiga's perseverance gained Lin Suixin's approval, so he and He Xiaoxi did not need to fight and entered the top 10? But at this time, Lin Suixin let the cultivation teachers know this was not true. Lin Suixin spoke to He Xiaoxi who had turned to leave. "You do not need to return because you still have one last fight," he said emotionlessly to He Xiaoxi who was soaked in sweat. Then he said without pause, "He Xiaoxi, against Lu Qiga, be careful." As He Xiaoxi stopped walking, Zhang Yi shouted softly at He Xiaoxi. White Goat Cave belonged to the Green Vine Sword Academy. Zhang Yi, Ding Ning, He Xiaoxi, and Nangong Kaishu could be considered members of the same sect. They had fought together from beginning to end. In the eyes of others, Zhang Yi's words of encouragement and reminder were nothing. But for the usually low-key and humble Zhang Yi, it was unusual for him to speak in such a public setting. Zhang Yi was very excited and happy at this time. He knew that if Xue Wangxu was still alive and saw him, Ding Ning, and He Xiaoxi enter the top 10, he would be very happy and proud. He Xiaoxi nodded and slowly turned around. He did his best to regulate his breathing and walked back to the battlefield. On the other side, a youth in purple robes whose hair was soaked in cold sweat and whose left hand was tied tightly to his body staggered towards He Xiaoxi. This Dawn Sword School genius called Lu Qiga seemed to pay a great price with every step he took. Looking at his walking posture, many people could not help but feel that he was not walking on solid ground, but on a bed of nails with each step. Victory and defeat seemed to be determined from his posture. However, at this moment, a change occurred that shocked everyone. A cold and empty aura was formed around his body, and then it was quickly released into the surroundings. The reason it was said to be empty cold was because when this cold aura was felt, the inside of this youth's body seemed to be extremely empty, so much so that most of the true cold aura had instead shrunk into his body. For all the cultivators present, this strange feeling was like there was a piece of ice in front of them in the summer. Everyone felt cold, that the ice was giving off coldness, but they could not feel the true coldness. All of the cold energy was shrinking towards the inside of the ice. Clear sounds of inhaling could be heard from the spectating cultivators. As this cold and empty presence formed, Lu Qiga's black hair that was soaked in cold sweat started to flutter behind him, completely revealing his pale face. Then, his cheeks sunk slightly as though he was rapidly losing weight. The air around him started to hiss. Many threads of invisible primal energies of the universe flooded in from all directions into his body. Like a dried-up pond being instantly filled up, Lu Qiga's body started to give people a feeling of being filled up. His pale face began to be covered with a layer of ashen luster, but his sunken cheeks returned to their original state. Everyone felt as though weakness had left his body. He was growing stronger. Why is it like this? What method is this? Zhang Yi, who had boldly warned He Xiaoxi, turned to look at Ding Ning in shock and could not help but exclaim. Everyone present was shocked. Even Ding Ning frowned deeply with a grave expression. He knew what method this was, but he had only heard of it before and had never seen it with his own eyes. This kind of cultivation method was very mysterious and very useful. So at this time, he was more focused on sensing all changes in the primal energies of the universe around him, including the changes in Lu Qiga's body. He did not even notice Zhang Yi's question. The cold and empty presence started to disappear from Lu Qiga's body. The moment he completely disappeared, his body began to emit a true chill. Visible white flakes of cold mist formed around his body and sputtered outwards, like pieces of frozen waves splashing outwards. There were also threads of red energy that looked like lines of blood. No wonder he had to persist. Jing Liali looked at this strange scene and narrowed her eyes. She said with slight disdain, "This sword trials is not simple. Even a method like the Blood Fiend Demon Art has appeared." Blood Fiend Demon Art. Several breaths after she spoke, a cultivation ground teacher let out a cry of alarm. "It is the Blood Fiend Demon Art." This exclamation caused a wave of shock. What kind of method is this? Among the exclamations, Zhang Yi, who did not receive an answer from Ding Ning, turned to look pleadingly at Du Gu Bai and the others. At this time, his worry for He Zhaoxi surpassed his desire for knowledge. An evil method of the previous dynasty. Du Gu Bai took a deep breath and said gravely, "When losing large amounts of blood, one can use their empty bloodline as seal scripts to guide primal energies of the universe. But using this method to guide primal energies of the universe is too and cold. Even if one can temporarily increase combat strength, it is not beneficial to future cultivation." Zhang Yi was smarter than most people imagined. Even though Du Gu Bai said so, he still understood the power of this method. Even though this method could be thought of as an evil method that stimulated one's vitality, it could allow a cultivator to temporarily increase their combat strength after losing a lot of blood on the battlefield, and even become stronger than before they were injured. On some battlefields of life and death, the most important problem a cultivator had to consider was survival, and not future cultivation. "Everyone feels that my blood is about to run dry, and that I will undoubtedly lose." At this time, Lu Qiga, who had walked in front of He Zhaoxi, stopped and looked up at He Zhaoxi. "But I do not want to lose." His tone was very calm, but everyone could feel his determination. He Zhaoxi was a man of few words. Hearing Lu Qiga's words, he looked up slightly and said, "I also do not want to. Can you still win?" Lu Qiga looked disdainfully at He Zhaoxi and the large sword he carried on his back and sneered. He was not a particularly arrogant person, but at this time, the other's situation and his own strength caused him to change. As he sneered, he stepped on the ground and swung his sword towards He Zhaoxi. He didn't even hold his sword in a salute. But no one cared about such details at this time. He held a copper-long sword in his hand that contained the power he had paid a great price for. Just such a simple sword move gave off a domineering presence. It felt like a mountain falling from the sky and pressing down on He Zhaoxi. He Zhaoxi was like a small tree that could only be crushed to powder. There was an explosion. He Zhaoxi's sword was in his hand, but his body immediately bounced back. Lu Qiga's figure appeared where he had been standing. He Zhaoxi's body fell just a few feet from the edge of the sword mark, leaving behind a cloud of dust. Threads of blood flowed from between his fingers along the sword hilt. A trickle of blood flowed from the corner of his mouth, but his expression remained calm. His gaze also fell on the exceptionally thick longsword in his hand. This cyan broadsword gave people the feeling that it was a horse-slaying saber. When He Zhaoxi's gaze landed on his sword, Lu Qiga suddenly felt something was wrong. He immediately realized what was wrong. Chapter 300. In all the previous battles, He Zhaoxi had been using this wide sword to fight. Yet, this wide sword was too ordinary and did not leave a clear impression on anyone. Since there was the sword selection round in the Sword Valley, no matter how stupid He Zhaoxi was, he could not choose a sword that had nothing special other than its width. Lu Qiga howled. Sensing danger, Lu Qiga's copper longsword sprayed out crimson-red ice and snow. His body immediately landed in front of He Zhaoxi. With a boom, his copper longsword smashed down like a mountain towards He Zhaoxi's head. He Zhaoxi raised his sword to block. Amidst the explosion, the ground under his feet rippled like a wave. At this time, the falling mountain was a mountain of ice. Amidst the air waves, pieces of sharp crimson ice shards pierced his body. Instantly, many bleeding wounds appeared on his body. Seeing this scene, Zhang Yi was extremely worried. He opened his mouth but forgot to breathe. He could not make a sound. He Zhaoxi sprayed a mouthful of blood. Yet, with a muffled grunt, He Xiaoxi was not pushed back like he had been in the previous attack. His body bent slightly and then straightened like a bow. His sword was still pushed upwards and forced Lu Qiga and his sword back. In this moment, He Xiaoxi's left hand landed on the sword hilt. Vital energy flowed from his left hand's fingertips, and he polished a seal script on the sword's spine. The spine of his sword was a small, thin sword embedded inside. It was just that at a certain distance, it couldn't be seen at all. As the rune lit up, the small sword flew out along the body of the big sword. Pew! There was a tearing sound. Lu Qiga moved to the side in shock. A small green sword light with a whirlpool brushed past his body at a terrifying speed. He Xiaoxi started to counterattack. He used all his strength to swing his sword towards Lu Qiga. His strength was greater than most of the students. When he swung his sword, air poured into the center of his sword, creating a thunderous roar. His presence was astounding. Yet for Lu Qiga, what was most astounding was not the presence and power, but the fact that He Xiaoxi's heavy sword seemed to have suddenly become several times lighter, and his sword moves were faster than before. The air that rushed into the groove in the center of the green broadsword supported the green broadsword, as if the broadsword was also flying. Lu Qiga swung his sword in shock. He Xiaoxi's sword move changed again. The blue broadsword that had been heading for his head drifted towards his right wrist. In the previous battles, his sword moves were heavy and ferocious. However, at this moment, his sword moves had become light and swift. Lu Qiga found it hard to breathe. He pulled back his sword to defend, but at this time, he heard the howl of a sword behind him. He turned his head subconsciously. Out of the corner of his eyes, he saw a thin and faint sword light flying over like a light blue mist. What kind of sword is this? Among the spectating students, someone shouted out his thoughts in shock. The thin sword that had flown out of the sword flew back to He Xiaoxi's green broadsword. Lu Qiga could not deal with the two attacks at the same time. His vital energy surged out of his feet, and two waves of dust carried him to the side like two wings. He Xiaoxi chased with his sword. The thin sword that flew back naturally returned to his blade. In the next moment, the thin sword flew out of his blade with a hiss and stabbed towards Lu Qiga. Lu Qiga's face paled again. He looked at the small sword with eyes filled with anger and shock. He took a deep breath and stabbed at the small sword with his sword at his fastest speed. Then there was a loud clang. A powerful ripple surged in front of him. He shouted angrily amidst the spray of energy. He accurately stabbed the small sword. The small sword spun out like a leaf. But he saw that the small sword did not fall to the ground and was still flying towards He Xiaoxi's wide sword. At this time, this wide sword was moving lightly and strangely towards his abdomen with a loud roar. He Xiaoxi was only using one sword. But at this time, he seemed to be facing two swordsmen at all times, and two extremely fast swordsmen. The spectators were silent. This was definitely a shocking and unexpected battle. The moment Lu Qiga showed the Blood Fiend demon art, almost everyone felt that victory belonged to Lu Qiga. But when He Xiaoxi's sword started to show its true power, the outcome seemed to be reversed. It is the Green Tower sword? Pan Rui looked at the sword in He Xiaoxi's hand and couldn't help but ask Huang Jinwei next to her in a clearing where the court officials were stationed. There are very few mother-child swords. Only the mother-child swords of the Bazin Kendo ground are so wondrous. Huang Jinwei nodded emotionally and responded softly. Once again, a violent and shrill howl resounded in the field. A crimson energy surged out of Lu Qiga's body. It was dozens of feet long like the tail of a comet. Yet he still could not deal with the combined attack of the two swords. His body continued to rise and retreat. A series of dense sounds of air waves colliding rang out. A long string of pits appeared in the ground in front of him. When he was dozens of feet away from the sword marks, he was still unable to counterattack. His body started to turn cold again. The primal energies of the universe that the Blood Fiend demon art had gathered in his body were almost used up. His strength right now was above He Xiaoxi's. Relying on his greater strength, he could deal with one sword that was slightly faster than him, but he could not deal with two swords that were faster than him. I did not lose to you. I lost to the sword in your hand. Lu Qiga knew he was going to lose. Yet when he thought of how he was just one step away and could not enter Min Mountain Sword Sect to cultivate because of this sword, he was extremely unwilling. Looking at the sword light surging towards him again, he gave a shrill shout. He raised his sword, not to meet He Zhaoxi's sword, but to cut his own throat. His sword was naturally not as fast as Yantai Guanjian's. The crimson-red sword light had just appeared when a sword essence landed on his sword. The power of this sword essence completely neutralized the power of his sword, causing his sword to fall limply to the ground. The advancing He Zhaoxi immediately stopped because Yantai Guanjian had appeared between him and Lu Qiga. Yantai Guanjian nodded slightly at He Zhaoxi and then turned to look at Lu Qiga, who was starting to tremble. He said gently and seriously, "In the life of a cultivator, when you close a door, other doors will open. The worst result is to close all the doors yourself." Lu Qiga's mind was blank. He seemed to be unable to think of the meaning of these words, but just now, the death intent that filled his heart started to dissipate. He sadly hung his head. "You won." Zhang Yi was stunned for a long time before he finally recovered. He was overjoyed and then in admiration. "Little sect brother, you are a god." He could not help but look at Ding Ning next to him and say seriously. Ding Ning frowned. He was thinking of something and still did not respond. The last battle had finished. Lin Suixin was very satisfied with this result. He did not disguise his satisfaction at all. A rare hint of an interested smile appeared at the corners of his mouth. Then he started to speak. "Ding Ning, Zhang Yi, Exian, Xiero, Du Gabai, Yihaoren, Ku Shichuan, Li Shixing, He Zhaoxi, you have 15 minutes to rest." Now, there were 9 students left, and he could only read out 9 names. At this time, many of the students who had been eliminated had mixed feelings. Some people were extremely sad and dispirited. Seeing that there was still one spot missing, they wanted to take it. Finally, someone could not help but shout. "Since the top 10 can enter Min Mountain Sword Sect to study, who is missing?" Hearing this, Lin Suixin smiled faintly and said, "Not missing? Not missing?" The students looked in disbelief at Lin Suixin and could not understand. "Adding on Su Lianhua, there are 10, Lin Suixin said coolly. "Su Lianhua?" At these words, not just the students and cultivation teachers, even Zhang Yi and the others stilled. "How can it be Su Lianhua?" A student could not help but shout. Lin Suixin glanced at the student and said, "He defeated Chen Liqiu, and then did not participate in the next round. Naturally, he is in the top 10, but his injuries are too serious, and he cannot participate in the next round." The student was stunned and speechless. All the students on the other side of the hut were speechless. The last spot was empty, and it was Su Lianhua. Other than Yihaoren and Ku Shichuan, the rest of the top 10 were all people who had been on Ding Ning's side from the start. All of these students felt extremely complicated. Their faces started to burn like they were ashamed, and also like they had been slapped hard. Many of the cultivation teachers grimaced. This was an inconceivable result, but it had appeared so clearly in front of them. Xiero's body could not help but tremble again. She had only wanted to do her part for Ding Ning, but had never thought she could enter the top 10 and enter Min Mountain Sword Sect to study. But at this time, she saw Ding Ning's brow was still furrowed. "What is it?" Her joy and excitement receded like the tide. She could not help but ask softly. "Nothing." Ding Ning's gaze flashed and he said, "Who was the last pawn in the Imperial Palace?" At this time, Jing Lioli, who had been standing in the hut, said in a cold voice to Yantai Guanjian, who had returned to his side, "Sect Uncle Lin should have seen it, but I cannot." Yantai Guanjian wanted to speak, but sensed an unusual presence. He frowned and turned to look at the mountain path behind him. Chapter 301. People like Yantai Guanjian naturally had a presence that could control a storm. While he did not show any of his vital energy, when he turned and looked back, he caused the darkness around him to tilt in his direction. Ding Ning immediately sensed Yantai Guanjian's abnormality. Following Yantai Guanjian's gaze, he saw a youth in indigo robes appear on the mountain path. Wearing the unique indigo robes of Min Mountain Sword Sect, he was naturally a disciple of Min Mountain Sword Sect. Also, the youth had a young face, and looked to be about the same age as Ding Ning and the others. He had to be Tantai Guanjian's junior in the sect. Yet Ding Ning knew that most people would only sense Tantai Guanjian's turn when his emotions were clearly fluctuating. Then he noticed Jing Liuli's brow furrowed deeply. Among the new generation of Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivators, no one had cultivation that could trouble Jing Liuli. So Jing Liuli's present cultivation could only be due to this youth's identity. Also, this youth's appearance should not have been part of her plans. Who is it? Ding Ning turned around, glanced at Li Shixing and asked. Usually, when people were puzzled, they would ask him. But this time, he was the one asking Li Shixing, because he also sensed Li Shixing's body vibrate strangely. Among the top 10 students, Li Shixing was one of those who had entered the top 10 with the easiest entry. That was because his actions were extremely ruthless. That kind of coldness came from his bones, like the nature of a wild beast. This kind of coldness did not just disregard the lives of others, but even his own. He gave everyone the feeling that if there was a possibility of killing his opponent, he would not show mercy. But this kind of coldness caused the two opponents he encountered to lose their courage to fight. At the start of the battle, when they felt they were at a disadvantage, they admitted defeat in fear. A person like Li Shixing would not be afraid of experts. The only possibility was that he recognized this youth in green robes. Li Shixing was silent for a moment and said, I said before that it may not be a good thing for me to stand on your side. Before the others could react, Ding Ning said calmly, So he is Duanmu Jingzong? Duanmu Jingzong? Zhang Yi reacted and asked in shock, What is he doing here? Du Gubai frowned deeply as he stared at the youth who was slowly approaching. Duanmu Jingzong was an official disciple of Min Mountain Sword Sect, but his status in Min Mountain Sword Sect was far from Jing Liuli's. He did not understand what Duanmu Jingzong could do, because the matter of the past in Chongling was related to two marquisate establishments. Almost everyone knew about it. That young youth dressed in indigo robes had just walked into the mountain valley. In some low conversations, all the cultivation teachers understood his identity. Everyone's expressions grew strange. Duanmu Jingzong walked very steadily and quietly. As he got closer and closer, everyone could clearly see his clean and delicate features. His face was even younger than Ding Ning and the others, like a child who had not grown up. But as he walked, he had a presence that surpassed ordinary students. His clear gaze was focused on the path ahead of him. He did not scan the surroundings as he walked straight towards Lin Suixin. Lin Suixin's eyes showed even more interest. 50 feet from him, Duanmu Jingzong stood still and bowed. He said clearly, Greetings, Sect Uncle Lin. The Sect Master has kindly allowed me to attend the last sword competition. Please arrange it. What? The valley was in an uproar, and the sounds of discussion buzzed incessantly. However, after a breath of time, the sounds of discussion suddenly vanished. Jing Liuli had appeared next to Lin Suixin and Duanmu Jingzong. You are going to attend the last top 10 trials? Jing Liuli's cold voice sounded into everyone's ears. Duanmu Jingzong nodded and said shyly, As an inner sect disciple, there is no reason for me to attend the trials. So I asked to see the sect master and have him allow me to leave Min Mountain Sword Sect and attend the trials as an ordinary student. Although this was a little ridiculous, the sect master still allowed it. Thinking that I should have no problem passing the previous stages, he only made me take the same medicinal powder and then made me eat a sea willow pill. The mountain valley was in an uproar again. When everyone learned of his identity, they could guess that he had appeared for past revenge. But no one had expected him to use such a method to seek revenge, and no one had expected Bailey Sushue to agree. It is very simple to have your body close to these people. Jing Liuli narrowed his eyes at Duanmu Jingzong and said, But Master will not agree. With Sect Uncle He as an example, I do not dare to use Master's name. Duanmu Jingzong's expression did not change as he said, But the Sect Master allowed me to leave Min Mountain Sword Sect and attend the trials as an ordinary student. He has a condition. Considering that I have cultivated in Min Mountain Sword Sect for many years, he said to me, If I lose to any of these people, I will not pass the trials and will no longer be a disciple of Min Mountain Sword Sect. At these words, all the cultivation teachers in the mountain valley were shocked speechless. But Jing Liuli's expression did not change. Her tone grew colder. Since Master has agreed, I cannot stop you. But are you sure you want to do this? Duanmu Jingzong smiled bashfully and bowed slightly to her. He said, I will trouble Senior Sect Sister. I hope Senior Sect Sister will agree. Jing Liuli did not say anything else and did not look at him. She turned and walked back to Yintai Guanjian's crude hut. Everyone's shock spread like a storm that had been brewing for a long time. How can it be like this? Xiao's face became very pale. Because her emotions were fluctuating too violently, her voice trembled. The goal of most students was to enter the top 10 and obtain a chance to cultivate in Min Mountain Sword Sect. But Ding Ning wanted to win. Duanmu Jingzong joining the top 10 competition was creating a powerful opponent for Ding Ning. Also, Duanmu Jingzong, who had cultivated in Min Mountain Sword Sect for many years, may be stronger than anyone ranked above Ding Ning on the Book of Talents. Zhang Yi's face was also pale, and his lips were trembling, but he had no way to say anything. This was the decision of the Min Mountain Sword Sect Master, and the trials were a ceremony for him to choose disciples. Such a powerful move. Dugu Bai looked at the seemingly childish and harmless Duanmu Jingzong with a disdainful expression. We all thought that she had hidden a hidden pawn, but no one had expected that she had buried such a clear pawn. Exin understood the meaning in Dugu Bai's words. He was stunned speechless, but his heart grew cold. Li Shixing had been exiled outside the pass until the winter before the year when he was allowed to return. He had come to participate in this sword trials. From the words he said when he stood next to them, they faintly sensed that Li Shixing's meaning was to be an enemy of Ding Ning in the trials. But Li Shixing chose to rebel. At this time, Duanmu Jingzong was using being expelled from Min Mountain Sword Sect as a wager to participate in the final competition. This price was not possible just for the hatred of childhood. Li Shixing and Duanmu Jingzong seemed to have the shadow of the mistress of the Chongling Imperial Palace behind them. All of them showed the mistress' ability to do whatever she wanted. As expected, you have not changed. You are still so cautious that it is irritating. At this time of chaos, Ding Ning's expression did not change much, but a hint of indiscernible disdain appeared at the corner of his mouth. Chapter 302. The younger they were, the more impulsive and hot-blooded they were. Adults were usually more cautious and would weigh the pros and cons. So the older they were, the more they feared death. People like Xue Wangshu were rare in Chongling. The valley returned to silence. Looking at the young Duanmu Jingzong, all the cultivation teachers present felt colder than Exin, Dugu Bai, and the others. Because they had deliberately wiped out the Bazin Kendo ground and the traces of that person, there were very few records of that mistress of Chongling in the records. However, everyone knew that she was perfect. Her appearance was perfect, her cultivation speed was perfect, and her plans were perfect. She seemed to have never failed in anything she did behind the scenes. Being too perfect was the same as being terrifying. Even more importantly, she seemed to be everywhere, constantly reminding all the cultivators of Chongling of her terror. Do you know what his cultivation is now? Dugu Bai frowned slightly and asked Li Shixing. Li Shixing did not speak and simply shook his head. Dugu Bai's gaze swept over everyone around him, and his expression became even more solemn. That means no one knows his current cultivation level. He should have cultivated Min Mountain Sword Sect's heavenly breathing method. Ding Ning glanced at him and said, unless he starts to fight, no one can sense his true cultivation. You have to be first? Dugu Bai grimaced and looked seriously at Ding Ning. If you are afraid of not fighting for first, then I will stand on the other side, Li Shixing said coldly before Ding Ning could answer. Even if Duanmu Jingzong is on the other side. Hearing their words, Ding Ning said calmly, I want first. Zhang Yi could understand the meaning in Dugu Bai's words. He was usually the most humble and gentle, but at this time, he said with a pale face, my junior sect brother is not afraid of death. I am not afraid. Dugu Bai was silent for a moment and said, I wonder what Lin Suixin will do next. This is no longer just a gamble between White Goat Cave and Zhengxiu. In the simple and crude hut, Jing Liuli stared coldly at Ding Ning's figure and said, right now, there is still Shizuan and Zhang Xiu's bet. Master is proud. He will allow Duanmu Jingzong to do this because he accepted the wager. He wants Zheng Xiu to know about Min Mountain Sword Sect. Even if Zheng Xiu has such arrangements, she will lose. Sect Uncle Lin understands the spirit of Min Mountain Sword Sect better than I do, and Master's pride. So the following matches will be absolutely fair and will not contain any of his personal emotions. After saying this, she turned to look at Tantai Guanjian, who had been listening to her, and added, I only hope that Ding Ning will not disappoint Master. Yintai Guanjian maintained his silence. Bailey Sushua's judgment naturally surpassed him, Lin Suixin, and the other Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivators. This meant that Bailey Sushua also thought highly of Ding Ning. But Bailey Sushua's opponent was Empress Zheng Xiu. Bailey Sushua did not have much confidence in such a wager. Pan Rui's expression was slightly cold. Before the Deer Mountain Conference, she rarely left the cultivation grounds of the Imperial Palace. So she cultivated peacefully and rarely had any special emotions. In the view of anyone, she should be one of the Empress people. But at this time, she started to understand why Li Shixing had made such a choice at the start and rebelled to stand on Ding Ning's side. This was because she felt as if there were countless invisible spiderwebs in the air around her. These spider threads formed an enormous web. These invisible spider threads were like strings that were used to control marionettes, connecting everyone around them. She did not feel that some of the things the Empress did were wrong, but she did not want to become a puppet to be controlled. On the mountain path between the cliffs, the yellow-robed middle-aged man who had been delivering messages for palace attendant Rong showed more bitterness. He had started to suspect that Ding Ning could win, but now he lost confidence again. There was still some time to rest. Ding Ning sat down. Zhang Yi and the others naturally wanted to sit down as well, but their figures suddenly froze. Ding Ning looked up at the other end of the hut. The mountain valley was still silent, but an unusual presence rose. Duanmu Jingzong was not sitting quietly on the other side, and was slowly walking towards them. In the darkness, Duanmu Jingzong's steps were light. His red and thin lips were slightly raised, and there was a happy smile on his young face. No hatred or anger could be seen. Long time no see. When he was still a distance away from Ding Ning and the others, he spoke to Li Shixing. His young face was still filled with a smile, and people felt that he was very innocent. But because of this, many people felt a chill and felt that this person was slightly abnormal. Li Shixing looked coldly at him and did not want to speak. It is good that you do not like to speak. Duanmu Jingzong walked closer and smiled even more amiably. Do you know why I killed your dog back then? Li Shixing suddenly looked up and his breathing sped up. Because that dog did not like me and always liked to bark at me. Duanmu Jingzong smiled and said, I like that dog very much, but it did not like me. Just like back then, I wanted to be friends with you, but you did not like me. Li Shixing growled in a low voice, I'm going to kill you. Back then, you wanted to kill me, but you cannot kill me now. Duanmu Jingzong shook his head and said, Back then, you broke 2 of my ribs. Today, I will break 2 of your ribs. After saying this, he did not look at Li Shixing, but at Ding Ning, who had sat down. He said with a smile, Actually, I have another reason for participating in the sword trials. It is because of you. Ding Ning glanced at him and did not immediately respond. You really are very funny. Duanmu Jingzong's young face did not show any disdain, but his words were full of mockery. You wanted to be first from the start, but you did not think that back then. We did not dare to mention first in the trials. What kind of background do we have? We did not even dare to do this since we were young. With your background, you want to be first. Are you not mocking all of us? After a pause, Duanmu Jingzong said sincerely, So in the following trials, the 2 opponents I hope to encounter the most are Li Shixing and you. Deathly silence. The expressions in the eyes of many of the teachers became even more complicated. Duanmu Jingzong's viciousness likely meant that this wine shop youth's fate would be tragic. Ding Ning looked at Duanmu Jingzong and still did not speak. Duanmu Jingzong did not care. He smiled slightly and turned around. Previously, I learned of your past with Li Shixing. I thought that if I encountered you and fought, I would also break 2 of your ribs. But the moment he turned around, Ding Ning said, But I have seen you now. If we meet in the trials, I will break 4 of your ribs. Ding Ning's expression was calm as he spoke. His tone was also calm. In everyone's impression, he spoke like this most of the time. But inexplicably, seeing him speak, most people felt even colder than when they first thought of the Empress' perfection. This coldness was even more real. Duanmu Jingzong did not look back. The smile on his face started to disappear. But before he could speak or do anything, Ding Ning, who was sitting on the ground, stood up. Some gasps sounded uncontrollably. Ding Ning gripped the hilt of the last flower sword and then bowed to Lin Suixin in the distance. He said, "If permitted, I want to fight him." An even louder cry of surprise rang out. Zhang Yi, Du Gubai, and the others looked in disbelief at Ding Ning. They even doubted their eyes and ears. Ding Ning's words were clearly an invitation to a duel. He wanted to fight Duanmu Jingzong directly. If this was any other time, such a duel invitation would have been established. But in the trials, he needed Lin Suixin's agreement. Everyone's shocked gazes gathered on Lin Suixin. Inviting me to a duel? Duanmu Jingzong smiled after recovering from his shock. Chapter 303. Everyone on the sidelines thought that he would say something to make Lin Suixin agree, but his performance once again surprised everyone. He smiled, shook his head and said, "Apologies, I refuse." Lin Suixin's eyebrows rose slightly. He glanced at Duanmu Jingzong and did not speak. Ding Ning looked calmly at Duanmu Jingzong's back and said, "You do not dare?" Everyone's heart skipped a beat. This was no different from a naked provocation. Duanmu Jingzong's smile suddenly disappeared. He turned around and looked coolly at Ding Ning. He said, "There is no hurry." Ding Ning also looked at him and said emotionlessly, "If we are late, we may not meet them." Duanmu Jingzong was not angry and smiled sweetly. "You are very confident. You seem to feel that you can defeat me." Duanmu Jingzong spoke to Ding Ning, but his gaze landed on Li Shixing behind Ding Ning. He smiled and said, "I understand what you mean. You feel that you are stronger than Li Shixing and me, but at the same time, you feel that Li Shixing is not as good as me. So you fear that I will encounter Li Shixing in the following trials, and Li Shixing's fate will be tragic. So you want to finish me first. I have seen you fight. You are very strong." After a pause, Duanmu Jingzong's gaze landed on Ding Ning. He said with a gentle smile, "I must win to become a disciple of Min Mountain Sword Sect again. So I should be careful. It is better to use less energy to defeat easier opponents than using up large amounts of energy from the start." Shameless. Hearing these words, Xiaoro couldn't help but curse angrily. Previously, Duanmu Jingzong had come to provoke. But when Ding Ning challenged him to a fight, he said such words. He was very shameless. Most people present felt that Duanmu Jingzong was very shameless. But the more shameless a person was, the harder they were to deal with. To be so shameless in the face of provocation, these people had a higher opinion of Duanmu Jingzong. But what they could not imagine was, did Ding Ning really feel he could defeat Duanmu Jingzong? "You really think that way?" At this moment, a cold voice suddenly rang out, causing many people to hold their breaths. The one who spoke was Li Shixing. Li Shixing looked coldly at Ding Ning. What he said was just his guess. Ding Ning looked at him and said, "If that's the case, I thank you for your kindness." Li Shixing no longer looked at Ding Ning. He looked at Duanmu Jingzong and said coldly, "I will fight you." When this taciturn young man spoke for the first time, most of the people had guessed what he was going to say next. But when they heard it for themselves, they couldn't help but gasp. This matter was related to an old grudge that everyone in Chongling knew of many years ago, especially involving 2 marquisate establishments. If such a duel occurred, the battle between 2 youths with old grudges would likely be much bloodier and crueler than normal duels. Duanmu Jingzong laughed. His smile was very sweet. No anger could be seen on his young face, and he even appeared very naive. But looking at this smile, most people felt even colder. Many people's gazes unconsciously landed on the still calm Ding Ning. They even started to suspect Ding Ning's motives for standing up. They started to suspect if Ding Ning had purposefully created this situation so that Li Shixing could wear down Duanmu Jingzong's strength. Duanmu Jingzong's lips parted slightly, showing his white teeth as he prepared to speak. However, to everyone's surprise, Ding Ning had already spoken. Do not agree. Ding Ning looked at Duanmu Jingzong and spoke before he could. Duanmu Jingzong stilled slightly and said with slight disdain, Why can't I agree? Do you think I am afraid you will provoke me? After a pause, Duanmu Jingzong added scornfully, I will not provoke you with words, I will scold you. Ding Ning looked calmly at Duanmu Jingzong and said, The scolding will be very unpleasant. Those who had started to suspect Ding Ning stilled. Behind Ding Ning, Li Shixing frowned and opened his mouth to speak. What a joke. Duanmu Jingzong laughed loudly. Do you think I am afraid of your scolding? Your mother is a prostitute. Who knows if she sells her art and not her body, or her body and not her art? Ding Ning looked at him who was laughing and said calmly. Hiss, gasps could be heard all over the valley. The temperature of the entire valley seemed to have dropped along with the sound of the gasps. All the teachers of the cultivation places by the side of the field looked at Ding Ning in disbelief, their faces even turning cold and stiff. These words were extremely vicious. Because all the cultivation teachers present were old, they knew some of Changling's past. So they knew that Duanmu Jingzong's mother, Zhang Xiaohuan, had come from a brothel in the past and had been one of the most popular courtesans in Changling. While many courtesans back then sold their art and not their bodies, and Zhang Xiaohuan had been one of them, how could there be accurate records of these courtesans? At least, the history books of the Qin dynasty would not waste ink to record the lives of these courtesans. Things that had not been decided could not be refuted. Everyone thought that Ding Ning would attack Duanmu Jingzong viciously, but had not expected Ding Ning to insult his mother so viciously. Previously, Duanmu Jingzong was shameless. Now, he is very vicious. Hearing the gasps in the mountain valley, Jing Liuli said softly, He is using viciousness to deal with shamelessness. She seemed to be talking to herself, but also to Yintai Guanjie. When she said these words, most people in the mountain valley looked back at Duanmu Jingzong. Ordinary students would not dare to use such vicious words to attack Duanmu Jingzong's mother. Otherwise, even if they could become a Min Mountain Sword Sect disciple, they would suffer the cruel revenge of the Duanmu Marquisate establishment. But Ding Ning was different. From the start, he had shown he did not fear death. He could ignore the message that Palace Attendant Rong had sent and did not care about the Duanmu Marquisate establishment. That was why he could say such vicious words, and everyone was sure that he could say even more vicious words in the future. Duanmu Jingzong's smile and calmness had long disappeared. At this moment, his young and tender face seemed to be covered in a thick layer of frost. You are very good. Looking at Ding Ning, who was not in a hurry to speak, he took a deep breath and said these words. Then he turned to look at Lin Suixin, bowed and said, Insulting one's parents is a great enmity. Sect Uncle Lin, please fulfill my wish. What's wrong? You can't stand it after hearing someone curse at you? Lin Suixin had a slightly disdainful expression. He said, If it was me, even if he insulted my parents with words many times worse, I would treat it as a fart. The innocent will know they are innocent. Duanmu Jingzong did not look up and said coldly, Of course I am not as good as Sect Uncle Lin. You call me Sect Uncle. I will give you a word of advice. Lin Suixin put away his disdain and said emotionlessly, Since we have spoken, and you are determined, I can agree. Duanmu Jingzong smiled. His young smile appeared extremely cruel and chilling. You did not want to fight me, but I forced you to fight, so I still won. But Ding Ning was as calm as before. He looked at him and said, In the following duel, I will still win against you. Duanmu Jingzong glanced at him and said disdainfully, Is there any meaning in saying this now? There was an uproar in the field, and countless voices rang out. Only now did everyone realize that the duel had already taken place. Before everyone's fight started, Duanmu Jingzong and Ding Ning would fight first. Just a short while ago, everyone thought that Duanmu Jingzong was the strongest pawn of the perfect woman in the imperial palace. Zhang Yi's mind was blank. He was the closest to Ding Ning, but he was dazed and did not dare to believe this was true. In the distant valley, Huang Zhenwei's brows furrowed deeply at this moment. His eyes began to shine with an indescribable emotion. He thought of a possibility that even he felt was not possible. Chapter 304. Ku Shichuan's lips were pressed into a line. His eyes were strangely red again. He looked at Ding Ning from a distance, but could not understand Ding Ning's thoughts. Why are you doing this? Li Shixing could not understand Ding Ning's thoughts. He took a step forward and asked Ding Ning harshly. Ding Ning did not answer. He turned to look at the stunned Zhang Yi. He seemed to be talking to himself, but also to Zhang Yi. He said softly, "Since you are going to do it, you have to be thorough. I should be thanking you." Before Li Shixing spoke again, Ding Ning looked at him, Du Gubai, and the others. He said, "Without you, I would not have entered the top 10 so easily." Hearing his words, Li Shixing and Du Gubai stopped breathing at the same time. They felt that Ding Ning's words contained deep meaning, but this meaning seemed to be separated by a layer of mist. They seemed to be able to faintly see it, but could not grasp it. Ding Ning did not say anything else and walked towards the empty space ahead. Duanmu Jingzong narrowed his eyes slightly. For the first time, vital energy flowed from his body. In the next moment, his body was blown up by the wind and easily landed dozens of feet away. He waited for Ding Ning to walk in front of him. He was the only person present who did not ponder why Ding Ning was doing this. He had always been narrow-minded, so he only imagined killing Ding Ning with his own hands like he had killed Li Shixing's dog. "I only hope that you will not admit defeat before you fall," he said expressionlessly as he looked at Ding Ning who had walked in front of him. Ding Ning did not think carefully about the meaning of the words. He raised the last flower remnant sword and said, "Then what are you waiting for?" Many of the teachers of cultivation places frowned deeply. At this moment, Ding Ning did not even want the rest time that Lin Suixin had given him. Duanmu Jingzong took a deep breath and looked up. He had no sword in his hand. No one could see where his sword was. As his eyes emitted a biting cold light, he began to exhale. Right now, it was already summer. If anyone breathed normally, they would not produce white energy like in winter. However, as he exhaled, 2 streams of white energy came out of his nostrils. Then he glanced at Ding Ning. With just this action of looking, 2 streams of white smoke shot out from his nostrils, leaving behind several afterimages in the air in front of him. The sound of something breaking through the air could be heard. The 2 puffs of white smoke disappeared from his nostrils, but a real, crystalline sword aura appeared in the air and shot towards Ding Ning's forehead at a terrifying speed. Instantly, countless shocked voices rang out. Everyone could see that this was a sword seal technique. Using sword energy to draw seals, the primal energies of the universe would gather to attack the enemy. But Duanmu Jingzong was able to use his vital energy to cast such a move in the span of a breath. Among the shocked voices, there was a sudden crack, and then a wave of real coldness. The cultivators in the mountain valley found that the sound came from in front of Ding Ning. The last flower remnant sword in Ding Ning's right hand did not move. It did not even bloom with the white flowers that represented the last flower remnant sword. Yet, the crystalline sword energy that was falling towards his forehead had shattered. The shattered, sparkling sword energies were like countless fine stars as they shot backwards in the air in front of his brows. Then, they turned into fine streams of sparkling energy. Around these fine stars and streams of energy, there was a ball of deep darkness surging, the edges also starting to sputter out countless cold black lines. Many cultivation teachers reacted quickly, and their gazes unconsciously landed on Ding Ning's left hand. While Ding Ning's rise in Chongling had been astounding, and many of his cultivation matters were more secretive than the other young geniuses of Chongling, many cultivation places still knew that Ding Ning had received some of forefather Zhou's inheritance in the Zhou family ink garden, and that Ding Ning had mastered such a powerful fiendish condensation method. Duanmu Jingzong's pupils contracted slightly. A hint of surprise appeared in his eyes, and then it turned into a strange shout. A disbelieving shout burst out of his mouth as his sword energy cracked. At this time, the cultivation teachers who reacted the fastest had not yet had the time to look at Ding Ning's left hand. The sound of a violent tide sounded in the air. The black tide surged out of Ding Ning's palms. The cold, fiendish sword energies that had accumulated in Ding Ning's meridians all surged out of Ding Ning's body, forming a terrifying tide. Dozens of cold, fiendish sword energies charged out at the same time towards the screaming Duanmu Jingzong. Almost everyone held their breaths. At this time, the weather was slightly hot, and there were even the cries of toads in the forest. But because of this violent black tide, the mountain valley became bone-chillingly cold. Duanmu Jingzong's pupils contracted to tiny black dots. As he screamed, he raised his right hand. His right sleeve shattered into flying pieces. Rings of purple-red sword light swirled around his slender arm and flew outwards. Everyone saw his sword. This was a strange purple-red soft sword. A moment ago, it had been hidden in his sleeve like a poisonous snake and coiled around his arm. At this moment, as the purple-red sword light flew out, this soft sword that originally exuded a cold and cunning aura also exuded a violent aura at the same time. The rings of sword energy that formed around his arm were accompanied by powerful primal energies of the universe. Thunderclouds spun out. The thundercloud expanded rapidly, like the flying ribbons of a fairy flying in the sky in a picture book. In an instant, a curtain of violent thunderclouds formed in front of the violent black tide. Dozens of heart-shaking cracks sounded at the same time. Amidst the violent thunderbolts, dozens of cold black clouds were formed at the same time, emitting a terrifying aura. At this time, Ding Ning's figure disappeared from his spot. There were still the afterimages of small white flowers in the air. In the air between Ding Ning and Duanmu Jingzong, there seemed to be flowers scattered by goddesses that were still floating. However, Ding Ning's figure had already appeared in the rippling black clouds. Multiple blue lights lit up in the lightning that had not completely dissipated, so fast that even the eye could not catch them. Duanmu Jingzong screamed again, the purple-red soft sword in his hand nodding furiously like a poisonous snake. Wherever the tip of his sword went, the blue light flashed, and several dazzling sparks exploded in an instant. Ding Ning continued forward. The blue light flashed around Duanmu Jingzong. Duanmu Jingzong screamed and retreated. His wrist seemed to vibrate faster and faster, so much so that the purple-red soft sword in his hand seemed to vibrate like more and more poisonous snakes were flying around him. Yet, these purple-red snake shadows could only stay 3 feet in front of him. He could not even move his sword forward. What sword form is this? Because it was too fast, when Duanmu Jingzong had retreated a dozen steps and the golden light around him flashed, multiple students shouted in shock. Aurora Sword Manual. The fastest sword manual on the second sword nucleus. Jing Liuli narrowed her eyes and said to herself. This time, it was not just her voice that was cold, but her face as well. In such a short time, he even comprehended the Aurora Sword Manual of the Zhao Palace. Jing Liuli was not the only one to see Ding Ning's sword form that was so fast the blade could not be seen. These cultivation teachers were so shocked their bodies turned numb, and their usually steady hands started to tremble. Pan Rui's breathing completely stopped. She was one of the cultivators with the highest cultivation present, but even now, she could not see Duanmu Jingzong's true vital energy cultivation. Duanmu Jingzong did not have a chance to show his true vital energy cultivation. Ding Ning was at most peak Realm 3 and not Realm 4. Duanmu Jingzong's vital energy cultivation was definitely higher than Ding Ning's, but he had been suppressed by Ding Ning from the start and lost the initiative. Under the pressure of Ding Ning's pure pursuit of speed, he could only deal with it. He did not even have time to use his vital energy or move his sword. Even his vital energy flow was blocked. He could not even move his sword forward to counterattack. Everyone could see that Duanmu Jingzong could not be faster. Can you be faster? But at this time, everyone saw Ding Ning speak, and then Ding Ning's unique calm voice sounded in their ears. Chapter 305. Duanmu Jingzong did not speak. He did not have time to make a sound. The moment Ding Ning said the first word, Ding Ning's eyes lit up, brighter than the stars in the sky. Suddenly, many gentle auras appeared around his body. A glowing flow of water formed around his body. Although it was night, the sparkling and translucent stream of water sparkled, giving anyone the feeling that it was a lake under the setting sun. The indigo sword energy created by the Aurora sword manual from the last flower remnant sword had not changed at all. But when this glowing flow of water formed, the indigo sword energy sank into the flow of water and seemed to merge with the flow of water. It sped up. Duanmu Jingzong did not have time to think. His mind was taken over by terror as he furiously retreated. He did not have time to ponder how Ding Ning could be so fast, but he knew he could not keep up with Ding Ning's speed. But the unconscious reaction of a cultivator, like him, usually meant the reality of what was about to happen. Or rather, when he felt he could not keep up, everything had already happened. It was too late for his body to move. There was a loud bang. The ground several feet around Duanmu Jingzong was shattered. Dust and gravel formed a circular wave that furiously spread outwards with a terrifying force. Ding Ning's body seemed to be hit by a carriage and flew backwards. Many cultivation teachers had shock in their eyes. Most of the students who had been eliminated had shock and confusion in their eyes. They could not understand the scene in front of them. They could not understand why there seemed to be an explosion around Duanmu Jingzong, and why Ding Ning, who had been about to stab Duanmu Jingzong with his sword energy, had been sent flying. There was a muffled sound. Time seemed long at this moment, but in reality, it was extremely short. This was the sound of Ding Ning landing heavily. Ding Ning's feet landed on the ground dozens of feet away, and 2 balls of dust exploded under his feet. His face was slightly pale, but his body was unusually steady. The moment he landed, his knees bent slightly and easily neutralized the impact of the landing. He stood very steadily. Duanmu Jingzong's body appeared in the lotus-shaped dust and air. Everyone saw that his face was as pale as snow, and his eyes were filled with shock and confusion. Most of the spectating students did not understand what was happening. But in the next moment, Duanmu Jingzong's legs gave off intimidating sounds. These students looked in shock at Duanmu Jingzong's legs. Many bright red colors appeared in their eyes. Threads of blood shot out of Duanmu Jingzong's legs like sharp blades. A strange cry of fear, anger, and confusion rang out. Duanmu Jingzong finally gave a strange shout. Unable to control his body, he took a step back and fell to the ground. What's going on? How could this be? Seeing this scene, many students could not control their emotions and shouted. No one answered the students' questions. Ding Ning had already adjusted his breathing and the surging Jinyuan in his body. He said, "I hope you won't admit defeat so easily." As his voice rang out, his body had already begun to move forward. With a shrill hum, a slanted white sword light smashed towards Duanmu Jingzong's body as he advanced. This white sword light was like a goat's horn that was tilted upwards. This was the white goat hanging horn of White Goat Cave. The true sword essence of this sword was endurance and stalemate. Based on Ding Ning's previous performance, he had more exquisite sword forms to use for this attack. Yet Zhang Yi, who had been dazedly watching this battle, felt his eyes moisten. He could sense the meaning of this sword, the meaning of his little sect brother's attack. Under Shui Wangshu's teachings, he had comprehended the true meaning of White Goat Hanging Horn. Yet at this time, he felt that even Shui Wangshu's sword essence could not compare to Ding Ning's. Jin Liuli's face paled slightly. Even Yintai Guanjian's breathing stopped. This was the most perfect sword essence he had seen in recent years. Most of the spectating students changed expression. They felt that Duanmu Jingzong, who was sitting on the ground, could not stop this attack. Did Ding Ning want to kill him? However, the competition had not ended yet. It was completely understandable that Ding Ning took advantage of the situation to attack. Another furious shout came from Duanmu Jingzong's mouth. Blood was still spurting out from the sword wounds on his legs, releasing intense, sizzling sounds. However, at this moment, he forcibly stood up and swung his sword forward. There was a muffled sound. The purple-red sword hit Ding Ning's last flower remnant sword like a hammer. Then the soft sword moved like a viper, wrapping around Ding Ning's sword and cutting towards Ding Ning's finger. But at this time, Ding Ning's left hand was pressing towards Duanmu Jingzong's chest. Duanmu Jingzong's left hand shot out like lightning. There was an explosion at the same time. In the next moment, There was a sharp sound of metal scraping, gasps, and the sound of bones cracking. Duanmu Jingzong vomited blood. His body bent backwards, and he fell back uncontrollably. Ding Ning's left hand was still in an extended position, the waves of energy still wrapping around his arm. The purple-red sword wrapped around his remnant sword weakly scraped against the last flower remnant sword as Duanmu Jingzong retreated, creating threads of fire. Why is it like this? Many students found it difficult to breathe. In just now's battle, Ding Ning's power had overwhelmed Duanmu Jingzong. His left hand had pushed aside Duanmu Jingzong's left fist and then hit Duanmu Jingzong's chest. They did not need to hear the sound of bones cracking just now. Seeing Duanmu Jingzong vomiting blood, they were certain that several of Duanmu Jingzong's ribs had been broken. Ding Ning had really broken Duanmu Jingzong's bones. But how was this possible? Duanmu Jingzong's vital energy cultivation was far above Ding Ning's. How could there be such a difference in power? Ding Ning ignored their shock. He did not pause at all and continued to move forward with his sword. There was not much vital energy flowing on his body right now, but when he passed through the chaotic air currents and dust ahead, an indescribable presence formed. So strong. Only now did Dugu Bai's breathing return to normal with some difficulty. He could not help but exhale. But then he felt it was not enough and said, "Too strong." Duanmu Jingzong's eyes were filled with Ding Ning's figure. Sensing this indescribable presence, his anger turned to terror. He was certain that if he did not admit defeat, Ding Ning would mercilessly break several of his ribs in the next moment. "I admit defeat." He opened his mouth and let out an anxious and uneasy scream. Ding Ning did not hesitate to put away his sword and turn around. Everything quieted down. The entire mountain valley fell silent. Even the sound of breathing seemed to disappear. There was only the faint chirping of cicadas in the distant forest. All the spectating students looked in shock at Ding Ning's figure and realized the battle was over. Duanmu Jingzong, who had been the last to join and had even gambled leaving Min Mountain Sword Sect, had lost to Ding Ning. Then, all of them began to replay the battle scene that they had just captured in their minds. Even the dumbest students started to understand what had happened just now. Ding Ning had immediately used all the cold sword energy he had accumulated in his body. Starting with violence, he then used his fastest sword form. Duanmu Jingzong did not even have a chance to counterattack. He did not even have a chance to use his vital energy and use his cultivation advantage over Ding Ning. In the next moment, Ding Ning used the sword manual of Cloudwater Palace. Using the sword manual of Cloudwater Palace and the Aurora sword manual, he moved even faster. When Duanmu Jingzong's sword arrived, his body sank into the terror of death. His body instinctively pushed out his vital energy and primal energies of the universe. While the great power produced prevented Ding Ning from cutting off his legs, the vital energy and primal energies of the universe in his body were almost used up. Even his blood was shaken to its limits. So this was the true reason Duanmu Jingzong could not muster any power. He could not match Ding Ning in terms of power and had his bones broken in one blow. Duanmu Jingzong was like a peerless sword, but this sword did not even have a chance to leave its sheath before it was broken. Why is it like this? While they knew the reason, many students could not help but exclaim in their strong disbelief. Chapter 306. Everyone could sense the power contained in Duanmu Jingzong's vital energy explosion. Even with the suppression of the medicine, and possibly other methods that Bailey Sushua had added when allowing him to participate, Duanmu Jingzong's vital energy cultivation had reached the peak of Realm 4. His body had naturally leaked out in a dangerous situation, and the primal energies of the universe that had not condensed into a wave of energy had sent Ding Ning flying back. A major realm difference in cultivation caused Ding Ning's power to be like a child and an adult in front of him. How could a child win against an adult? But now, the adult had been beaten down by a storm of punches from a child, and did not even have a chance to punch. Many students felt inexplicably uncomfortable. They instinctively put themselves in Duanmu Jingzong's place, thinking that if they had Duanmu Jingzong's great power, they would not even have a chance to display it. They did not even have a chance to use their sword, and they felt uncomfortable. Just thinking about putting themselves in Duanmu Jingzong's place made them uncomfortable. As the person involved, Duanmu Jingzong naturally felt even more uncomfortable. This kind of discomfort surpassed the pain he was experiencing. Blood was still foaming at his mouth, and he couldn't help but yell out crazily, "I will definitely kill you. You are taking advantage of the situation. Next time, you will not be a match for me." Hearing this shout, Ding Ning, who was walking back, did not respond. He did not even frown. This still caused Duanmu Jingzong to be unable to use his strength. He was stunned and felt even more discomfort as he shouted, "In order to win against me, you used all of your accumulated cold, fiendish sword energy at once. I want to see how you will win." All the spectating students and cultivation teachers were shocked. This was a problem Ding Ning had to face. Ding Ning frowned slightly. He stopped and turned to look at Duanmu Jingzong, who was sitting on the ground with a crazy and vicious expression. "You know so much about me. Your true goal in joining the sword trials is me, and not Li Shixing. You are willing to be someone's tool. You are not a commander, but a pawn. What is there to be angry and discontent about?" These words were not loud, but not just Duanmu Jingzong, but many students outside froze when they heard them. Some even unconsciously lowered their heads that they usually held up proudly. They all understood what Ding Ning wanted to express. In this grand sword trials that attracted the attention of the world, no matter how outstanding they were just pawns on the opposing sides, and Ding Ning was a general. He fought with his own will, against Palace Attendant Rong and the perfect shadow that was everywhere behind her. Just from this point alone, he was already a level higher than all of them. Therefore, although Ding Ning's words were flat, they could feel the pride in them. This pride was enough to make them repent. Duanmu Jingzong's mouth was agape, but his expression froze. He was speechless. A cultivation teacher turned to look at the camp resting on the cliffs behind him. He knew that Palace Attendant Rong would also be looking at this mountain valley. Duanmu Jingzong was a vicious pawn in the trials. If such a setup spread, all the cultivators in the world would admire and fear the abilities of the perfect woman in the imperial palace. Yet such a vicious pawn had been so easily defeated by Ding Ning. This invisible slap was resounding. He thought that Palace Attendant Rong's expression would be spectacular. Palace Attendant Rong was thinking the same as this cultivator. She was staring at the figures of Duanmu Jingzong and Ding Ning in the night. But unlike what he had imagined, Palace Attendant Rong's expression had not changed much. She still had a cold and noble expression. Duanmu Jingzong recovered from his daze. He was extremely narrow-minded and would not be appeased by Ding Ning's words. He gritted his teeth and could not help but say something more. But at this time, Ding Ning did something that stunned him. Ding Ning turned and bowed to Lin Suixin. Then he looked at He Zhaoxi and said, "I want to challenge He Zhaoxi." Cries of disbelief rang out like a tidal wave. Even Dugu Bai, Exian, and the others widened their eyes in shock. Little sect brother, you? Zhang Yi could not understand what Ding Ning meant. His voice trembled, and he could not say a complete sentence. "You want to challenge He Zhaoxi now?" Lin Suixin looked coolly at Ding Ning with a meaningful smile at the corners of his mouth. Ding Ning nodded and said, "If permitted, I want 15 minutes to rest." Uproar. Everyone was certain they had heard correctly. Ding Ning had just defeated Duanmu Jingzong, and now he wanted to challenge He Zhaoxi to a duel. Just the continuous requests for a duel were shocking enough. Also, He Zhaoxi had been on his side from the start. Yet at this time, Palace Attendant Rong, who had been looking at the valley, changed expression. For the first time, she showed true shock. Why? When everyone's gazes gathered on him, He Zhaoxi, who had been low-key in the crowd, frowned slightly and looked up at Ding Ning. Ding Ning looked at him and did not answer. But through his gaze, He Zhaoxi knew that Ding Ning felt there was no need to answer. "When did you discover it was me?" He Zhaoxi asked seriously after a moment of silence. Then he looked at Ding Ning and said, "If you do not resolve my doubts, I will not agree to duel with you." As he said this, soft gasps sounded again. Zhang Yi, Xiero, and the others looked at He Zhaoxi and quickly paled. "He is the Empress hidden pawn?" Jing Liuli took a deep breath and slowly shook his head. He said, "Even I did not see that he is the Empress hidden pawn." Amazing. Yintai Guanjian felt these words were old-fashioned. But after thinking for a moment, he still felt that these words were the best to describe his feelings at this time. First, he took care of Duamu Jingzong, and now he is challenging He Zhaoxi. Jing Liuli gave a rare smile and said, if he is going to do it, he will do it thoroughly. In the end, am I the one who arranged this competition, or him? He wants to defeat these people one by one? On the other side of the valley, Huang Jinwei had a hint of a grimace. He felt his speculations were becoming reality. The commotion in the valley continued. Most people did not think as deeply as Huang Jinwei and Jing Liuli. They only reacted because of He Zhaoxi's words. He Zhaoxi was the hidden pawn. Everyone had to admit that as the hidden pawn, He Zhaoxi was the best choice. Because he was too mediocre, he didn't attract much attention. Other than his unique mother-son sword, many people did not have much of an impression of his face. Even they, who were watching from the sidelines, could not see such a hidden pawn. How could Ding Ning, who was in the game, detect it? If he could not get an answer to this question, if it was him, he likely would not be able to calmly fight. You are too calm. Ding Ning's voice sounded and the chaos in the valley suddenly disappeared. From beginning to end, you have been too calm. He Zhaoxi frowned deeply. He thought for a moment and said, your reason does not convince me. You are also very calm. I am not like you. Ding Ning shook his head and looked at him. He said, I am calm when I see Zhang Yi and Xiero because I am certain they will win. I know what will happen next. But you do not understand me. You do not understand them as well as I do. You do not understand those swords and sword manuals as well as I do. Being as calm as I am is unusual. After a pause, Ding Ning said slowly, this kind of calmness makes your joy after seeing them win seem fake. I only see this kind of fake in your eyes. He Zhaoxi's expression darkened and he said self-deprecatingly, in a sword trial like this, you still have the mood to observe the minute expressions in each person's eyes? Ding Ning nodded and said, because I am not a pawn, what I need to pay attention to is different from you, a good commander-in-chief. He Zhaoxi sighed emotionally, and then his hand landed on his sword hilt. At this moment, his action made everyone understand that he had accepted this duel. Why? An angry and confused voice sounded at this moment. Zhang Yi looked at He Zhaoxi, his chest rising and falling violently. You are a student of Green Vine Sword Academy. White Goat Cave belongs to Green Vine Sword Academy. If junior sect brother Ding Ning wins, Green Vine Sword Academy will also be honored. The summer cicada is unearthed and shocked the world. Who shocked the world is very important. He Zhaoxi looked calmly at the excited Zhang Yi. He looked up at the distant mountains and said, you do not know, but I do. Not long ago, a cultivator died in the mountains of Min Mountain Sword Sect. That person was also surnamed He. Chapter 307. The Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator with the surname He was naturally He Shanjian. At this time, most of the students present did not know that a cultivator of Min Mountain Sword Sect had died before the last competition. Yet, almost all the cultivation teachers present knew of this matter. However, they did not know how He Zhaoxi learned of this, or the relationship between He Zhaoxi and He Shanjian. He is my uncle. When I was young, I practiced the sword with him. He Zhaoxi looked at the distant mountains and said slowly. Zhang Yi did not know what had happened. He looked in puzzlement at He Zhaoxi. He did not understand what the death of the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator had to do with Ding Ning. My uncle is the best cultivator of the He family. Whoever he listens to, the He family naturally listens to. He Zhaoxi did not look at Zhang Yi and continued. Hearing this, all the cultivation teachers who knew that He Shanjian had died at Bailey Sushua's hands knew that He Zhaoxi, He Shanjian, and the other cultivation places of the He family had always been the perfect mistress people in the imperial palace. You are so willing to be used by others? Zhang Yi looked in puzzlement at He Zhaoxi and said in a trembling voice, I always think that cultivators should follow their own emotions. My uncle died because of this matter. The person who killed my uncle wants to bet that Ding Ning will win. I do not want Ding Ning to win. This is my most direct emotion right now. He Zhaoxi interrupted Zhang Yi and said. Many cultivation teachers felt a chill in their hearts once again. He He Zhaoxi's words caused them to think of which cultivator to die, and the most suitable cultivator to die may have been purposefully arranged. The middle-aged man in yellow robes standing on the mountain path could not help but feel sorrowful again. The horizontal and vertical Chongling was a chessboard. People like him and He Zhaoxi could not escape the fate of being chess pieces. Zhang Yi increasingly felt that He Zhaoxi's words were absurd, but he could not find words to refute him. "I'll wait for you." He Zhaoxi did not say anything more to him. He looked away from the distant mountains, glanced at Ding Ning at his side, and started to walk towards the open space ahead. Everyone's eyes once again fell on Ding Ning, and then many people held their breaths. They saw Ding Ning quietly closing his eyes, as if he was using this short period of rest to meditate and replenish his true essence. Lin Suixin didn't say anything and just waited patiently. 10 minutes was very short, as precise as an hourglass. At the end of the 10 minutes, Ding Ning opened his eyes. Then, he bowed to Lin Suixin, who was waiting patiently, and said, "Senior, please don't arrange any more matches. I will challenge them one by one." "What?" When Duamu Jingzong appeared and was quickly defeated by Ding Ning, and then Ding Ning found He Zhaoxi, the most unlikely hidden chess piece. The cultivation teachers and students present had become numb to the waves of shock. Yet when Ding Ning spoke, they were still shocked and could not help but doubt their ears. Ku Shichuan and Yi Haoran's bodies uncontrollably shook. They couldn't help but look at each other. Ding Ning had not looked at the two of them when he spoke to Lin Suixin, yet the two of them knew that Ding Ning's next opponents could only be the two of them. Yi Haoran's brow furrowed deeply. Ku Shichuan could not help but laugh. He laughed happily and sincerely. This was the funniest joke in the world. Zhang Yi, Du Gubai, Yi Xian and the others were stunned. They finally understood the true meaning behind Ding Ning's words. If you want to do something, do it thoroughly. Ding Ning wanted to use his own power to defeat He Zhaoxi, Ku Shichuan, Yi Haoran, and the others to win. You guessed he was going to do this long ago? Pan Rui heard the gasps around her and looked at Huang Jinwei, whose expression did not change. She frowned slightly and asked coolly. Huang Jinwei grimaced and said softly, "When he challenged Duanmu Jingzong, I had a feeling, but I had not expected him to actually do this. If he can win like this and end the competition, it will be more satisfying. This will give White Goat Cave and Shui Wangshu the greatest glory." Pan Rui looked away from Huang Jinwei and took a deep breath. She murmured to herself, "He really is worthy of the last flower sword in his hand. Only a person like him can turn this sword trials that the world pays attention to into a grudge between him and the imperial palace. Only he can be so ruthless." Du Gubai refocused and shook his head in admiration. He said, "If he can win against He Zhaoxi, Ku Shichuan, and Yi Haoran, we will give up on fighting him. He will naturally be first." Yi Xian smiled bitterly and said, "If he can do it, will you not give up?" Du Gubai laughed. "He is enough to be my teacher. If he can win against 3 people in a row, he will naturally be first in the Min Mountain Sword Trials. Do I have the face to fight him?" "It is winning against 4 people in a row," Yi Xian said emotionally. "Duamu Jingzong, He Zhaoxi, Ku Shichuan, Yi Haoran, of all the young geniuses in Chongling, who can win against these 4 people in a row?" Zhang Yi opened his mouth but could not speak, because even he felt that it was impossible. Even though he always felt that his little sect brother was extraordinary, Ding Ning was made of flesh and blood. He would get tired, bleed, and use up vital energy. This is impossible. Finally, a student shouted in shock. Daring to do it is one matter, being able to do it is another. At this moment, a mocking laugh filled with ridicule rang out, clearly reaching everyone's ears. The speaker was Ku Shichuan. Ku Shichuan's eyes were so red they seemed to be rouged. He looked disdainfully at Ding Ning, who was walking towards He Zhaoxi. He sneered and said, "Xie Chongqing said that my judgment of you will be reversed each time, but I do not believe it. If a Realm 3 cultivator can win against a Realm 4 cultivator in a row, what is the use of the cultivation records in the world dividing the realms so clearly?" Most of the students present did not like Ku Shichuan, this Shadow Mountain Sword Cave student who had inexplicably risen to the top 3 of the Book of Talents. They especially disliked his feminine presence. But his words shocked them, and they realized that Ding Ning was not in the same realm as Ku Shichuan and Yi Haoran. Ding Ning had not reached Realm 4. If he wanted to win, he had to win against those of higher realms. This was absolutely impossible. This was something that had never been recorded in the history books of the cultivation world. But were there really no records like this? Looking at the expressions of Ku Shichuan and the students, Jing Liuli's eyes showed slight shock, but also clear disdain. She thought inside, it is not that there are no records like this, but Chongling does not have such records. You are too young and have not seen such records. Ding Ning did not respond to Ku Shichuan's words. In his view, as that woman's hidden pawn, He Xiaoxi was more dangerous than Ku Shichuan. Facing an opponent he had chosen and was fated to defeat, even thinking of words of disdain was a waste of energy. A patch of black clouds floated over. It covered the stars, and the valley appeared even darker. The timing was perfect. Ding Ning finally felt some joy in his heart. This was impudence. After being in Chongling for so long, this was the first time he felt such pleasure and could be so impudent. Come. He looked up at He Xiaoxi, who was much taller than him. Then he raised the last flower remnant sword and held it across his chest. He Xiaoxi also looked up. He heard the distant chirping of summer cicadas. For him, this was a chirp that belonged to him. Then he gripped the sword Ding Ning had chosen for him and attacked without hesitation. In the darkness, an ear-piercing chirp sounded. Chapter 308. The Min Mountain Sword Trials had always been the focus of the world. Because of Ding Ning, the trials had gained many unique colors. Ever since his identity as a hidden pawn was revealed, He Xiaoxi, who was unknown compared to most of the students participating in the trials, was fated to leave his name in the records of future generations. This was a true case of shocking the world with a single brilliant feat. Yet when the sword howled like a cicada, He Xiaoxi did not advance but retreated. His previous exhaustion had completely disappeared. His body gave off a feeling of being filled with vitality and power. With one step, an oval pit appeared under him. He was thrown back like a stone thrown from a catapult. At the same time, the excessively broad sword in his hand gave off glowing sword energy as thin as cicada's wings and slashed towards Ding Ning like it was cutting through the night. Many students felt admiration and even shame at this moment. He Xiaoxi's attack was extremely steady and confident. Ding Ning had chosen this mother-son sword for him, yet he had no hesitation in attacking. He was also not in a hurry. It was as if his opponent was not someone who could make him even more famous, but just an ordinary opponent. These students thought that if they were in his shoes, they would not have such a calm state of mind at this time. Even more importantly, He Xiaoxi appeared to be full of vital energy and stamina right now. Now, everyone could see that He Xiaoxi had deliberately concealed his strength. Yet, in order to conceal his strength, He Xiaoxi had paid a great price, lost a lot of blood, and fought for a long time with his opponent. Being able to maintain an abundance of true essence and physical strength after repeated injuries and battles was his most frightening aspect and greatest advantage. So, He Xiaoxi was not in a hurry. He could slowly wear down Ding Ning. He felt that Ding Ning would be more anxious than him. In Ding Ning's intentions, he did not just want to defeat him alone, but leave power to deal with Ku Shichuan and Yi Haoran. So his first attack was called Cicada Curtain Heavy. Each strand of sword chi seemed to be as thin as a cicada's wing, light and fragile. However, if Ding Ning wanted to enter, these strands of sword chi would instantly pile up like a curtain and become extremely heavy. Jing Liuli narrowed his eyes and looked at He Xiaoxi's attack like a cat staring at a mouse. She thought that there was nothing wrong with He Xiaoxi's attack and strategy. She just wanted to see how Ding Ning would respond. The cicadas continued to chirp. Ding Ning stood where he was and did not move a single step. He simply thrust his sword forward. Cries of surprise rang out. Especially Zhang Yi and Xiero, their faces were as white as snow. His body was instantly surrounded by countless sparkling and translucent sword chi like cicada wings. When the sword chi flew past, many drops of blood appeared in the air. Ding Ning's body was cut in many places, with bright and hot blood splashing out. How could this be? Many students stilled and could not help but wonder inside. Previously, they had been unable to believe it because Ding Ning had been too strong. Now, they had accepted Ding Ning's strength and could not believe that such a strong Ding Ning would be wounded by He Zhaoxi's attack. But they could not believe it because they could not understand Ding Ning's response and attack. They could not understand, but most of the teachers and cultivators of Min Mountain Sword Sect who were far stronger than them could understand. Powerful. Gungren shook his head and gave a soft sigh of admiration. Jing Liuli frowned slightly. Ding Ning's strength caused her to feel nervous and uncomfortable again, even though she also admired Ding Ning. While Ding Ning's skin was cut in many places and looked terrible, the wounds were very shallow. They did not even need to be treated and would immediately stop bleeding. Just now, Ding Ning had only used his sword to deflect away some of the sword chi that posed a true threat to him. Ding Ning's attack did not even use up any vital energy. This sword was like an army of arrows. Tens of thousands of arrows fell on him, but he could see clearly the few arrows that were the real threat to him. Other than those few arrows, he didn't care about the rest of the arrows. Just by paying a small price, he was able to expend a round of arrows. He Zhaoxi also did not understand Ding Ning's attack. Seeing the blood droplets flying in the air, although he could not understand, his sword was still steady. His body was still flying backwards, and before his feet landed on the ground, he had already made a second strike. Dozens of green sword lights swam forward along the body of his sword. Their speed was astonishing, but they twisted and turned in the air, and the order of each sword light was slightly different. These dozens of indigo sword lights were like vines that wrapped around Ding Ning's frail figure. This was one of the famous sword forms of the Green Vine Sword Academy, Green Vine Coil. Ding Ning moved forward naturally. Then, he struck again with his sword. This time, his attack was even simpler. The last flower remnant sword in his hand did not give off the feeling of a sword form, and just knocked on a vine like a short stick. Then, he walked through the dozen or so green vines that were making hissing sounds. More than 10 green vine-like sword chi landed behind him. In this moment, many uncontrollable gasps sounded in the valley. Many students finally understood. The teacher of the Green Vine Sword Academy who had brought He Zhaoxi and Nangong Kaishu to attend the Min Mountain Sword Trials could not help but take a step forward, his expression incredulous. Ding Ning had easily defeated this Green Vine Coil. Any sword form naturally had flaws, weaknesses that could be found, and could be defeated. But even this teacher of the Green Vine Sword Academy had not expected this Green Vine Coil to be so easily defeated. Ding Ning seemed to have seen the weakest point of this sword form with a glance. Then he did not use any special sword moves, just casually hit the weakest point of this sword form, and walked out of the net of sword energies. He just relied on an ordinary stab, timing, and footwork so natural. This kind of defeat caused this teacher of the Green Vine Sword Academy to have the feeling that Green Vine Coil was so weak. He even started to doubt all the sword forms in the Green Vine Sword Manual. He Zhaoxi's expression changed. His breathing completely stopped in this moment. He did not dare to believe it, and his body instinctively attacked again. Countless green sword energies appeared in the air in front of him and floated towards Ding Ning. This was the 1,000 Leaves Fall of the Green Vine Sword Academy. The meaning was countless green leaves falling from the sky. These sword energies were naturally denser, more chaotic, and untraceable. All the gasps suddenly stopped. All gazes gathered on Ding Ning. Ding Ning's figure still did not make any violent movements. Under everyone's shocked gazes, he moved forward as though he was walking normally, and then attacked with his sword. Even as the green leaves fell, his posture was still very natural. He flicked, stabbed, and slashed. He seemed to casually strike down some of the falling green leaves. The ground around him hissed. Small beads of blood flew up from his body. Yet, he quickly walked out of the green leaves dancing in the air. Even the white flowers on the last flower remnant sword had not bloomed. The teacher of the Green Vine Sword Academy was so shocked he could not describe it with words. His body trembled. He Zhaoxi forgot to retreat, his face as white as paper. Seeing Ding Ning come closer, he finally understood that he could not use a long-distance sword form to deal with Ding Ning. A violent howl came from his throat. With this loud roar, his arms seemed to have doubled in size. His muscles bulged, and the excessively wide green sword in his hand suddenly emitted a dazzling green light. The entire sword was raised high, and at the same time, his feet stomped on the ground, and his entire body leapt into the sky. It was as if he was holding a mountain-splitting axe and was about to cut open a gully in the ground as he smashed it down towards Ding Ning. This was the mountain-splitting axe, a common sword move that many swordsmen in the Qin dynasty army would use. It purely pursued an instant of explosive power. Since he was certain he could not use his previous method to deal with Ding Ning, He Zhaoxi immediately changed tactics. He wanted to use pure power to overwhelm Ding Ning. Yet, in this moment, Ding Ning naturally stopped his advance and took a step back. The huge sword light fell, landing a foot in front of him and to his side. Pieces of cracked and exploded earth even smashed into his body, but he simply raised his sword and stabbed out diagonally. With a hiss, the sound of sword energy tearing through the air came from his last flower sword. He Zhaoxi screamed. His body flew backwards before he could stabilize, leaving afterimages in front of him. Fresh beads of blood flew through the air. A faint line of blood appeared on his abdomen. Chapter 309. Many of the cultivation teachers were so shocked they could not speak. Ding Ning's attack was natural. His footwork, position, and timing were exquisite. Not to mention a cultivator who had learned the sword for less than a year. Even cultivators who had been immersed in the sword path for decades, like them, would find it difficult to achieve such perfection. Most cultivators in the world would not be able to achieve such perfection in their entire lives. Most cultivators would not be able to do it in their entire lives. But a young person like this could do it. In the view of these cultivators, this had nothing to do with cultivation or birth, just talent. This was true peerless talent. The sword mark was very shallow. After He Zhaoxi landed, only some small beads of blood seeped out of his skin. Yet, this sword mark seemed to have cut into He Zhaoxi's heart. He stopped and looked at Ding Ning with an unusually pale face. He asked, "Why is it like this?" Ding Ning did not continue to attack. He stopped and looked at him. He said, "Your strongest attribute should be endurance. Your endurance is enough for you to wear down many people, but it is useless against me. Your vital energy and sword manual are too ordinary. No matter how much effort you expend, I do not need to expend any effort to deal with you." All the students and cultivation teachers listened intently to Ding Ning's words. Most of them thought that Ding Ning was right. He Zhaoxi's greatest weakness was that his sword forms were too ordinary compared to the other top geniuses. Yet, all of them thought that Ding Ning's words were unreasonable. Even if they were ordinary, from He Zhaoxi's performance just now, he was a Realm 4 cultivator and used the exquisite sword moves of the Green Vine Sword Academy. A Realm 4 cultivator could not force a Realm 3 cultivator to use their full power. It was absurd for a Realm 3 cultivator to say that a Realm 4 cultivator's vital energy and sword forms were too ordinary. At this time, Ding Ning looked at the unusually pale He Zhaoxi and said, "Can your vital energy be stronger? Have you comprehended an even more exquisite sword manual?" The mountain valley was silent again. Ding Ning's words were said calmly, but most students felt unspeakably uncomfortable when they heard this. Earlier, when Ding Ning was fighting Duanmu Jingzong, he had said, "Can you be any faster?" Duanmu Jingzong could not be faster, so he lost. So Ding Ning's meaning was clear. If your vital energy could not be stronger, if you did not have a profound sword manual that was a level higher than the Green Vine Sword Manual, then you can admit defeat. In that calm tone, what was revealed at this moment was arrogance and recklessly burning impudence that did not put his opponent in his eyes. "I already knew that you were strong, but I didn't expect you to be this strong." Dugubai turned to look at the dazed Zhang Yi and couldn't help but smile. "You still underestimate your junior brother." Zhang Yi was dazed as though he was in a dream. He had seen Ding Ning's calm attitude many times, but he had never seen his junior brother burning like a wildfire. "Next, I will challenge you. I will let you know that while Xie Chongqing is not here, your words will still become a joke. At this time, Ding Ning turned slightly and looked at Ku Shichuan. Ku Shichuan's expression turned cold. He sneered. Is that so? You will not have any other ending. Ding Ning glanced at him and then turned to slowly raise his sword at He Zhaoxi. Either admit defeat or attack. He used his actions to force He Zhaoxi to make a choice. He Zhaoxi's mind was blank. He subconsciously thought of a sword move that he had comprehended from the sword embryo. That was a sword move far more exquisite than his other sword moves. Of course, he did not want to admit defeat, so he used this sword move. Chi. A cracking sound was emitted from the cyan sword in his hand. The small sword that was the spine of the sword once again left the body, turning into an indigo meteor that shot towards Ding Ning's figure. At the same time, his large indigo sword danced with a wild presence. Sword energy spun madly like the wind blades on some artifacts and turned into wild winds. The mist in the night sky suddenly thickened. The wild wind gathered the mist to form a tornado with many water droplets that leapt towards Ding Ning from all directions like serpents. He Zhaoxi's vital energy had reached its limit and was close to triggering the poison in his body. His body seemed to give off light. Wherever the wild wind blew, the stones on the ground were blown apart. He Zhaoxi's body advanced at the same time. The indigo sword flashed with many sword shadows like lightning in the wild wind. This sword move was the 10 Directions Thunderstorm of the former Wei Imperial Palace. While it did not match the Thunder Dragon sword of the court swordsman back then, it was astounding when used by He Zhaoxi. Seeing Ding Ning's figure disappear in the wild wind, many students thought they could not withstand such a blow. But in this moment, a clear sound rang in everyone's ears. Then, to everyone's shock, they saw a patch of fine white flowers appear in the tornado facing He Zhaoxi. He Zhaoxi's pupils contracted and his breathing stopped. The wild wind dissipated. Ding Ning's figure broke through the wind and stabbed towards his throat. Seeing his 10 Directions Thunderstorm appear to have no effect, He Zhaoxi's coldness could not be described with words. But in this moment, he reacted faster than usual. The indigo sword in his hand bent and swept towards Ding Ning's sword-wielding arm like a pole. Ding Ning suddenly pulled back his sword and held it horizontally to block. There was another loud clang. Ding Ning fell backwards like a bird with broken wings, falling into the countless wild wind formations behind him. He Zhaoxi's indigo sword vibrated rapidly and gave off a strange hum. This blow had forced Ding Ning back into the chaotic 10 Directions Thunderstorm. No matter how one looked at it, it was his victory. Yet, he inexplicably felt that something was not right. It was also at this moment that his breathing stopped abruptly. A green flowing light shot out from the scattered wind, and with a puff, it entered his abdomen. Blood sprayed out of his abdomen. He Zhaoxi screamed in shock and bewilderment. His body unconsciously retreated. Countless gasps could be heard. A small indigo hiltless sword was buried deep in He Zhaoxi's abdomen, the tip coming out of his broad back. Blood flowed down the tip of the sword like worms. He Zhaoxi bowed his head. Only now was he certain that what had pierced his abdomen was the sub-sword that had shot out of his sword. Just a few breaths ago, he had had a lot of energy in his body, but as the great pain passed from his sword into his mind, he felt that all his energy seemed to have been sucked out as he retreated a few steps. How can it be like this? He looked in front of him and screamed. Many cultivation teachers thought the same. They took a deep breath and looked at the roiling thunderstorm. Some awe appeared in their eyes, just like how they were Jing Liuli's seniors, but still looked at Jing Liuli with awe. They could understand why this was the result. Ding Ning had defeated the 10 Directions Thunderstorm and hit the small sword. He had slightly changed the trajectory of the small sword. Finally, when the sword had blocked, he had violently shaken the mother sword, causing the mother sword's energy to become chaotic and unable to catch the small sword that had shot back. However, they could not understand how Ding Ning was able to do this. Lin Suixin, who had been expressionless, laughed again. At this time, Ding Ning's voice sounded again and reached everyone's ears along with the wind. These are the sword moves recorded on the sword nucleus. I have seen them. You dare to use them? Also, you are so unfamiliar with them. Also, when I said those words, I knew you would use the sword moves on the sword nucleus." As these words sounded, Ding Ning's figure slowly came out of the wind and reappeared in everyone's sight. Everyone's gazes froze. Did he just spend such a short time to understand all the sword moves on it? A student could not help but shout in a daze. It is not a big deal if he understands. Jean Lioli also took a deep breath and then slowly exhaled. She murmured to herself, "The key is that if you understand, you can catch some of the others' mistakes and easily resolve them. That is true swordsmanship." Ding Ning turned and looked at Ku Shichuan. Behind him, He Zhaoxi slumped to the ground. Chapter 310. No one looked at He Zhaoxi. The sound of cicadas was still loud in the forest, but these sounds did not belong to him. The summer cicadas came out of the ground, shocking the world with a single feat. They still belonged to Ding Ning. Everyone's gaze gathered on Ding Ning. Some of the teachers of the cultivation places were shocked and somewhat numb. If such a person was not the champion, then who was the champion? Vital energy realm is easy for talented cultivators to improve, but to counter moves, battle instincts, comprehension and use of sword forms and sword essence is harder for cultivators to improve. Du Gubai looked emotionally at Ding Ning, who had turned around as He Zhaoxi fell to the ground. He shook his head and then bowed to the smiling Lin Suixin. He said seriously, "No matter what, I forfeit the following competition." Exian stilled and then looked at Lin Suixin. He said, "Me too." No one made a sound at this time. Everyone knew what Du Gubai and Exian meant. Ding Ning's previous actions showed his absolute trust in Du Gubai and Exian. He believed that if he could defeat He Zhaoxi and then defeat Ku Shichuan and Yi Haoran, then all his enemies would be defeated and he would not need to fight. Du Gubai and Exian publicly forfeited. Other than showing Ding Ning that they were trustworthy, they also showed that they believed Ding Ning could defeat Ku Shichuan and Yi Haoran. Zhang Yi looked stiffly at Du Gubai and Exian. He hesitated, but he still thought of Ding Ning's words. "Since you are going to do it, you have to do it thoroughly." He couldn't help but take a deep breath and then bowed to Lin Suixin. He said, "Me too. I forfeit." Xiaoro also bowed and said. Everyone's eyes fell on Li Shixing, who was standing in front of Xiaoro. Li Shixing frowned and sneered unhappily. "Can't you see that I have to say the word forfeit?" His tone was very rude, but no one responded. This was because the air in the valley seemed to have become heavier, making it difficult for many people to breathe. Now, it had nothing to do with the duel. Including Ding Ning, there were only 3 students left. Unless Ku Shichuan and Yi Haoran also forfeited, or Ku Shichuan and Yi Haoran fought first, the 2 of them would inevitably have to fight Ding Ning. "Ever since you saw me, you've been mocking me non-stop. The reason for that is because you're jealous of me. You don't believe that someone like me can be more outstanding than you." Ding Ning looked at Ku Shichuan, who had an extremely dark expression, and said slowly, "In the end, you feel that I am easy to bully. That White Goat Cave is easy to bully. If you were from a different background or a different powerful sect, you wouldn't have done this at all." Hearing Ding Ning's birth, almost all the students and the spectating cultivation teachers were shocked. They felt that Ding Ning's words were not just for Ku Shichuan, but also for that palace attendant role. Ku Shichuan looked down and said coldly, "There is no White Goat Cave." Ding Ning smiled and said, "Starting today, everyone will remember that Shadow Mountain Sword Cave is not as good as White Goat Cave." Ku Shichuan sneered and looked up at Ding Ning. He said, "You think you will definitely win? Even if you want to conserve your energy, just now, did you not use up a lot of energy and vital energy to receive He Zhaoxi's blow? I still have 15 minutes to rest." Ding Ning's eyes narrowed as he smiled. He said, "While the time is short, it is enough to recover the vital energy I just used." After saying this, he turned to look at Lin Suixin and said, "Can I rest for a cup of tea's time?" Lin Suixin smiled. He was too lazy to even nod. No one would have any objections. Even if the sword trials went according to the most normal rules, there would still be 10 minutes between each battle to heal and rest. Ding Ning closed his eyes. Then everyone saw that he had entered a state of introspection and cultivation. Many students felt even more bitter. They increasingly felt that Ding Ning was terrifying, and they knew that Ding Ning would become even more terrifying. Now, there are only 3 people left. There are no other possibilities. Pan Rui looked at Huang Jinwei next to her and said, "Who do you think will win in the end?" Huang Jinwei hesitated slightly and said with difficulty, "I think it will be Ding Ning." Pan Rui's expression suddenly turned cold. She said, "So you feel that she will lose this time? Her first defeat will be at the hands of this wine shop youth?" Huang Jinwei's breathing grew difficult. This didn't seem very likely, but in his judgment, it seemed like it was going to happen. Even if she does not win in the end, this kind of performance is enough to gain Bailey Sushua's favor. Pan Rui looked away from Huang Jinwei and into the night ahead. Her gaze did not seem to be focused as it floated in the night. If she really loses, in your judgment, what will be the fate of this youth? I do not know. Huang Jinwei shook his head. He really did not know. Because Zhang Xiu had never lost, he could not judge. The time to drink tea quickly passed. Ding Ning did not need anyone to remind him to open his eyes and wake up. There was a commotion in the crowd in the valley, and then it quickly became absolutely quiet. Ku Shichuan glanced at Ding Ning and did not speak. The deep red in his slightly sunken eyes suddenly deepened as though they were filled with blood. Then he started to draw his sword. His sword hilt was dark red, and the blade was even brighter red. As he drew his sword, a stream of blood seemed to flow out of the scabbard. As he started to draw his sword, Ding Ning started to swing his sword. The 2 sides disliked each other. They had said what they needed to say. Now, only battle was left. The drama began in an instant. Pew 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 pew. A heavy sword essence landed in front of Ku Shichuan. Then there were the dense buzzing sounds everyone was familiar with. Small pillars of dust rose from the ground, colliding and forming a sandstorm. Ku Shichuan's figure disappeared into the sand. As for the rolling sand and dust, it began to transform into countless dust swords. Ku Shichuan still started with the earth vein sword dust concealment. Before this, other than Nangong Kaishu, no one had been able to receive his sword. In the fight between Nangong Kaishu and Ku Shichuan, everyone had seen that Nangong Kaishu had been taught by Ding Ning. But this time, everyone immediately saw that Ding Ning did not use the same sword form as Nangong Kaishu. He swung his sword gently. It was like he was swinging a soft stream of water. As a wisp of faint aura spread out, his sword light brought out many sparkling and translucent streams of water wherever it passed. These water streams were disrupted by his sword light, shattered, and splashed into countless transparent water flakes, like countless fish scales, or like countless shattered mirror pieces. Ding Ning's figure turned into many Ding Nings under these glowing levels. What sword form is this? Many students had complicated emotions in their eyes. Ku Shichuan's sword was hard to defend against because he had completely concealed his figure. It was almost impossible to sense where he was in the sand. Now, there were many Ding Nings, and people could not be sure which one was Ding Ning's figure. This was using air against air, concealment against concealment. Also, they could sense that Ding Ning's sword did not need to expend much vital energy. At least, he used less energy than Ku Shichuan's sword. Ku Shichuan stopped. He could not sense Ding Ning's exact location. The changes in this sword form were enough for him to form thousands of dust swords and charge at all of the Ding Ning's figures in front of him. But he had a strong feeling that if he did that, he would just waste a large amount of vital energy in vain. The violent vibrations of energy suddenly disappeared. All of the pillars of dust collapsed as though they had lost their lives and rippled outwards on the ground. His figure appeared in the waves of dust. Almost at the same time, all of the glowing water in front of him turned into droplets and fell. Ding Ning's true figure appeared. The two held their swords and faced each other as though nothing had happened. "You are very lucky." Ku Shichuan looked coldly at Ding Ning and said, "You can see my sword. This sword has never appeared in the Shadow Mountain Sword Cave. You cannot have seen such a sword, so you cannot defeat it." At the same time his voice sounded, all the crimson color that filled his eyes instantly faded away. At the same time, a sharp sword intent suddenly appeared in his left hand, and then a thick crimson smoke gushed out. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.